They were bidding on her like cattle. Eliza Rowan stood frozen in the doorway of the saloon's back room, watching strange men lean over a table, discussing her price. Her stepfather's voice cut through the cigar smoke. She's young, healthy, and obedient, worth every cent. This was supposed to be her home. Instead, it had become an auction house, and she was the merchandise. But when one man stood up and outbid them all, he didn't claim her. He offered something no one else had: a choice. This is the story of the night that changed everything. Stay until the end to see how Eliza reclaims her freedom, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The autumn wind off the Rockies carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves through the narrow streets of Coal Ridge, Colorado. It was the kind of town that grew up fast and ugly around the mines, buildings thrown together with more hope than skill, streets that turned to rivers of mud when it rained, and men who came looking for silver but usually found only debt and desperation. Eliza Rowan had lived here for 3 years, ever since her mother married Frank Gaines and dragged them both west with promises of a fresh start. The fresh start had lasted about 6 months before her mother took sick with pneumonia and died in the cold room above the general store. After that, it was just Eliza and Frank had proven himself to be exactly the kind of man her mother should have run from instead of toward. He was a gambler, not even a good one. Eliza learned to make herself small and useful. She took in laundry, scrubbing other people's dirt from their clothes in the big tub behind the boarding house where they rented 2 rooms. Her hands were always red and cracked, her back always aching, but the work was honest and it kept them fed. Mostly. When Frank wasn't drinking away her earnings or losing them at the poker tables that ran every night in the back rooms of the Silver Spur Saloon. On the evening everything changed, Eliza was walking home from Mrs. Henderson's house, where she delivered a basket of clean linens. The October sky was already darkening, turning that deep purple blue that came just before full night. Her shawl was thin, and the wind cut right through it, but she walked quickly, her worn boots splashing through the half-frozen puddles on Grant Street. She was thinking about the stew she'd left simmering on the stove, just potatoes and onions and a ham bone Mrs. Henderson had given her, but it would be warm and filling. She was thinking about the book she'd borrowed from the school teacher, a novel about a girl in Boston who had adventures. She was thinking about anything except what was waiting for her at home. The boarding house was a sagging 2-story structure that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired of standing upright. The front door stuck in its frame, and Eliza had to push hard to get it open. Inside, the hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and unwashed bodies. She could hear Mr. Kowalski coughing in his room, that deep rattling sound that meant the mine dust had gotten into his lungs and would never come out. Their rooms were on the 2nd floor, at the end of the hall. As Eliza climbed the stairs, she noticed something odd. The door to their sitting room was ajar, and she could hear voices inside, men's voices. Frank rarely had visitors, and never this many. She approached slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. Through the gap in the door, she could see Frank sitting at the small table they used for meals, his face flushed and sweating despite the cold. Across from him sat 2 men she didn't recognize. One was enormous, with a thick black beard and hands like ham hocks. The other was thin and sharp-featured, dressed better than most men in Coal Ridge, with a silver watch chain glinting across his vest. "I've offered you a reasonable solution, Frank," the thin man was saying. His voice was educated, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. "You owe Mr. Blackwood $300. That's not a sum that simply disappears." I know," Frank's voice was high and desperate. "I just need more time. Another week, maybe 2. You've had 6 months. The bearded man spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Blackwood's patience is exhausted. Please," Frank was almost whining now. "I've got nothing left to give you. You've taken everything." The thin man leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Not quite everything, Frank. You still have the girl." Eliza's blood turned to ice. "What?" Frank's voice cracked. "You can't mean—" "I mean exactly what you think I mean." The thin man's tone remained pleasant, conversational. "There are establishments in Denver and even a few in Leadville that would pay good money for a healthy young woman, especially one who's not used to city life. They appreciate that freshness. I have contacts. We could arrange a sale, settle your debt, and everyone walks away satisfied. For a long moment, there was silence. Eliza stood frozen in the hallway, her hand gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles went white. Surely Frank would refuse. Surely he would throw these men out, threaten them, do something, anything, to protect her. "How much?" Frank asked quietly. Eliza felt the world tilt sideways. How much would she bring? Frank's voice was steadier now, almost businesslike. The thin man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Difficult to say without a proper examination, but given her age and appearance, I'd estimate we could get 400, possibly 450, enough to clear your debt with interest. 500, Frank said suddenly. I want 500, and you forgive the entire debt. The thin man exchanged a glance with his bearded companion. We'd have to see her first, of course. Make sure the merchandise is as advertised. That was when Eliza pushed the door open. All three men turned to stare at her. Frank's face went pale, then red. The thin man's smile widened. The bearded giant just watched her with flat, incurious eyes. Eliza. Frank stood up quickly, knocking his chair backward. You're home early. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw clearly for the first time what she'd been trying not to see for 3 years. This man had never cared about her. She had been a convenience when her mother was alive, a source of income after she died, and now she was simply a problem to be solved. Get out, she said quietly. Now, Eliza. Frank took a step toward her. Get out! She was shouting now, all the fear transmuting into rage. All of you, get out of my home! The thin man stood up slowly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. This is not your home, my dear. The rent is in Frank's name, and Frank has agreed to discuss a business arrangement. I'm not merchandise, Eliza's voice shook. You can't sell me like a horse or a piece of furniture. Actually, the thin man said gently, in matters of debt, there is considerable legal precedent. There's no law that says a man can sell his stepdaughter. Eliza looked frantically at Frank. Tell them you won't do this. Frank wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't have a choice, Eliza. You don't understand the kind of men I owe money to. If I don't pay, they'll kill me. So you'll sell me instead? The betrayal was a physical pain in her chest. My mother loved you. She trusted you. Your mother is dead! Frank's head snapped up, his face twisted with anger and shame. Dead, and she left me with nothing but debts and a mouth to feed. Don't talk to me about what she would have wanted. The thin man cleared his throat delicately. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. Mr. Blackwood likes to inspect his investments personally. I'm sure we could arrange a meeting. No. Eliza's voice was steel. I won't go anywhere with you. I'll scream. I'll fight. I'll tell the sheriff. The bearded man laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Sheriff Dockery. He owes Mr. Blackwood money too. You think he'll help you? The thin man put on his hat, adjusting it carefully. We'll give you both some time to discuss this rationally. But Frank, we'll be back tomorrow evening. Have the girl ready, or be prepared to face the consequences. He paused at the door, looking back at Eliza with something that might have been pity. For what it's worth, my dear, fighting will only make things harder. The houses in Denver aren't so terrible. Some girls even come to prefer it. Then they were gone, their footsteps echoing down the stairs. Eliza and Frank stood in the silence, not looking at each other. I'm sorry, Frank finally said. I'm so sorry, Eliza, but I don't have a choice. There's always a choice, Eliza whispered. You're just a coward. She turned and walked into her small bedroom, closing the door behind her. For a long time, she just sat on the edge of her narrow bed, trying to think, trying to plan. She could run, but she had no money, nowhere to go. The next town was 20 miles away across rough country. Winter was coming. She wouldn't survive a week alone in the mountains. She could go to the law, but if what they said about the sheriff was true, that was pointless. She could beg someone, anyone, for help, but who in Coleridge would stand up to a man like Blackwood? Everyone knew his name. He owned half the town and held debts on most of the other half. She was trapped. That night, Eliza didn't sleep. She lay in her bed fully clothed, listening to Frank's uneven snoring through the thin wall, and thought about her mother. How different would things be if she'd lived? Would they have stayed in St. Louis? Would Eliza be working in a shop somewhere, saving money for her own little apartment? Maybe courting some nice young man who'd ask permission before even holding her hand? Instead, she was here, in a mining town at the edge of nowhere, about to be sold like a piece of property. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, Eliza got up and went about her morning routine in a sort of daze. She built up the fire, made coffee, mixed up biscuits. Frank emerged from his room, looking haggard and ashamed, but he didn't apologize again. They ate breakfast in silence. "Maybe we could run," Frank said suddenly. "Both of us. Head up to Wyoming, change our names. They'd find us." Eliza didn't even look at him. "And you'd just gamble yourself into debt again. That's what you do." Frank flinched but didn't argue. The day dragged on with terrible slowness. Eliza tried to work, tried to focus on scrubbing clothes, but her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the soap. Mrs. Henderson noticed and asked if she was feeling well. Eliza lied and said she might be catching a cold. As the sun began to set, Frank started drinking. Not his usual social drinking, but desperate gulps from a bottle he kept hidden under the floorboards. "Liquid courage," he muttered. "God knows I need it." "Courage?" Eliza's laugh was bitter. "Is that what you're calling it?" Around 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Frank nearly jumped out of his skin, spilling whiskey down his shirt. He looked at Eliza with panicked eyes. "Maybe we don't answer. Maybe if we just stay quiet." The knock came again, louder. Frank stood up unsteadily and opened the door. The thin man was there, along with his bearded companion. But they weren't alone. Behind them stood two other men, one young and flashily dressed, with slicked back hair and a cocky smile. The other older, heavy-set, with the look of a man who'd spent years doing hard physical labor. "Good evening, Frank," the thin man said cheerfully. "I hope you've had time to reconsider our proposal, but I should inform you that circumstances have changed somewhat. Mr. Blackwood was quite interested in your stepdaughter's case, and he mentioned it to a few business associates. As it turns out, there's considerable interest, so we've decided to handle this in a more entrepreneurial fashion." "What does that mean?" Frank's voice was slurred. "It means, my friend, that rather than simply selling the girl to one buyer, we're going to let interested parties bid. Think of it as an auction." The thin man's smile widened. "Maximizes value for everyone involved, including you. Whatever the winning bid is, we'll deduct your debt and give you 20% of the remainder." "You want to auction off my stepdaughter?" Frank looked sick. "Your stepdaughter, who you've already agreed to sell," the thin man pointed out. "This merely ensures you get the best price. Now, shall we go somewhere more suitable? Mr. Blackwood has arranged for the use of a private room at the Silver Spur. Several interested parties are already waiting." Eliza had been standing silent in the corner, but now she found her voice. "No, I won't go." The bearded man moved with surprising speed for someone his size. He was across the room before Eliza could react, his massive hand clamping around her upper arm. "You'll go, girl, one way or another." "Let her go!" Frank lurched forward, but the young man with the slicked hair put a hand on his chest, stopping him easily. "Relax, Frank. Nobody's going to hurt her. Not before the sale, anyway." The young man grinned. "After that, well, that's up to whoever buys her, isn't it?" They took her like that, the bearded man gripping her arm, Frank stumbling along behind, mumbling apologies and protests that nobody listened to. Down the stairs, through the boarding house common room where the other residents carefully looked away. Out into the street, where darkness had fallen and the respectable people of Coleridge were safely inside their homes. The Silver Spur was the largest saloon in town, a rambling building with a false front that made it look more impressive than it was. Eliza had never been inside. Decent women didn't go into saloons. The irony wasn't lost on her. They went through the main room where men were drinking and playing cards and arguing about silver prices, and through a door at the back. A narrow hallway led to several private rooms used for high-stakes gambling. The thin man opened one of these doors and gestured for them to enter. The room was thick with cigar smoke. A table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs. 5 men were already seated, and they all turned to look as Eliza was brought in. She recognized two of them. One was Silas Blackwood himself, the man everyone in Coleridge owed money to. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face like weathered leather. His suit probably cost more than everything Eliza had ever owned combined. The other familiar face belonged to Marcus Hyde, who owned the largest dry goods store in town. Eliza had delivered laundry to his house. His wife had always been kind to her, giving her extra food and sometimes a coin or two beyond the agreed price. Now Marcus Hyde sat at this table, preparing to bid on her like she was a bolt of cloth. The other three men were strangers. One was clearly a miner still dirty from a day underground. Another wore the clothes of a ranch hand but had the hard eyes of someone who'd done worse things than punch cattle. The third was young, barely older than Eliza herself, with soft hands and the entitled air of someone born to money. "Gentlemen," the thin man said, closing the door behind them. "As promised, the merchandise." Merchandise. Eliza felt the word like a slap. Silas Blackwood stood up slowly, walking around the table to inspect her. He didn't touch her, but his eyes moved over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pretty enough," he said finally. "How old?" 18, Frank mumbled. "Healthy? No diseases?" "Healthy, yes, sir. She's a hard worker, too. Never been sick a day in her—" "I don't care about her work ethic," Blackwood interrupted. "I'm not hiring a maid." He returned to his seat. "Let's get on with this. I have other business tonight." The thin man, who Eliza now understood was some sort of lawyer or agent for Blackwood, positioned himself at the head of the table. "Opening bid is set at $200. That's the amount currently owed, and it serves as our floor. Who'll start?" "$250, the miner said immediately. $300, countered Marcus Hyde, not looking at Eliza. $350. The young man with the soft hands smiled. "I've been looking for a new house girl." The bidding continued, climbing higher. $400, $450, $500. Eliza stood there, the bearded man's hand still on her arm, and watched men discuss her price like she was a piece of furniture. Frank stood against the wall, staring at his boots, occasionally taking swigs from a flask he'd pulled from his pocket. When the bidding reached $600, Eliza noticed one man who hadn't spoken yet. He sat slightly apart from the others, in the corner farthest from the door. He was younger than most of them, maybe 30, with sun-weathered skin and work-roughened hands. A rancher or farmer, she guessed. He wore clean but worn clothes, and his hat sat on the table in front of him. He was watching her face, not her body. And he didn't look pleased to be there. $650, Blackwood said lazily. "Though I'm beginning to wonder if she's worth this much trouble." $700. It was the man in the corner. His voice was quiet but carried easily through the room. Everyone turned to look at him. "Well, well," Blackwood said. "Caleb Mercer decides to join us after all. I wondered why you were here, since you don't usually involve yourself in such matters." The man, Caleb Mercer, met Blackwood's gaze steadily. $700, cash. $750, the young man said quickly. $800, Caleb said without hesitation. The room went quiet. $800 was more than most men in Coleridge made in a year. Frank's original debt had been $300. The bidding had gone far beyond any reasonable expectation. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb with new interest. "That's quite a sum, Mercer. Didn't know you had that kind of money lying around." "I don't lie around," Caleb replied evenly. "I work." $850, the rancher with the hard eyes said. $900. Caleb's voice was calm, but Eliza saw his jaw tighten. $1,000, Blackwood said softly. "And I think that should settle it, don't you?" The room fell silent. $1,000. It was an insane amount for what they were doing. Eliza felt faint. Caleb Mercer stood up slowly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he counted out bills onto the table. $1,500, he said quietly. "And I'll thank everyone else to stop bidding now." Frank made a choking sound. The thin man's eyes widened. Even Blackwood looked surprised. "That's quite decisive," Blackwood said after a moment. "Though I confess I'm curious about your interest, Mercer. You've never struck me as the type to buy companionship." "I'm not," Caleb said flatly. He looked directly at Eliza for the first time, and his eyes were brown and steady. "I'm buying her freedom." The room erupted into confused murmurs. The thin man held up his hands. "Gentlemen, please. Mr. Mercer, I'm not sure I understand." "It's simple," Caleb interrupted. "I'm bidding $1,500. The money goes to settle Frank's debt and whatever profit you bloodsuckers plan to squeeze from this disgrace." He gestured to the bills on the table. "But I'm not taking possession of Miss Rowan," Eliza whispered. "Eliza Rowan." "Miss Rowan," Caleb continued, "will be free to make her own choices. She can stay in Coleridge, leave town, or she can come work at my ranch under a proper contract with wages in her own quarters. No obligation, no ownership. Her choice." The room was silent. Then Blackwood started laughing. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You're paying $1,500 to free a girl you don't even know? Mercer, I always thought you were soft, but this is beyond foolish. It's insane." Caleb's expression didn't change. "Maybe, but it's my money, and I'm making the offer. Do we have a deal or not?" The thin man looked at Blackwood uncertainly. Blackwood shrugged. "Money's money. If the fool wants to throw it away on principles, who am I to argue?" He stood up and held out his hand. "We have a deal, Mercer, though I warn you, Frank's debt is paid, but she has no protection once she steps outside this room. Any man here could make her a different offer, and if she's foolish enough to refuse—" "She'll be under my protection," Caleb said quietly. His hand didn't move toward Blackwood's. "And anyone who bothers her will answer to me." Big words. The rancher with the hard eyes stood up. "You willing to back them up, Mercer?" Caleb finally moved, turning to face the man fully. Eliza saw then that he was taller than she'd thought, and there was a confidence in his stance that suggested he knew how to handle himself in a fight. "Try me and find out, Dalton." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Dalton laughed and shook his head. "Not worth it. She's just one girl." He brushed past Caleb toward the door. "Though you're a fool, Mercer, a damned fool." The other bidders filed out, some throwing curious glances back at Eliza, others looking disappointed. Marcus Hyde paused as he passed her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I thought maybe if I bought you, I could give you to my wife as help. She's always liked you. I didn't mean—" "Get out," Caleb said coldly. Hyde left quickly. Finally, only Caleb, Eliza, Frank, and Blackwood remained. The thin man was counting the money, a small smile on his face. Whatever happened to Eliza, he was getting paid. Blackwood walked to the door, then paused. "This is a nice gesture, Mercer, but gestures don't change reality. Girls like her, with no family, no money, no prospects, they end up in places like Denver, whether you buy them or not. You've delayed the inevitable, nothing more." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Good evening." When he was gone, Eliza found she could breathe again. The bearded man had released her arm when Caleb started bidding. She stood alone in the center of the room, shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. Frank lurched forward suddenly. "Eliza, Don't!" Her voice was ice. "Don't say anything to me. Not now. Not ever." Frank's face crumpled. "But where will you go? What will you do?" "That," Caleb said quietly, "is her decision to make." He looked at Eliza. "Miss Rowan, I meant what I said. You're free. I'm offering employment if you want it. Honest work, fair wages, your own room with a lock on the door. My ranch is about 10 miles north of here. I run cattle and horses, and I could use help with cooking and general housekeeping. But if you'd rather stay in town or go somewhere else, that's your right. I'll give you enough money to get you started." Eliza stared at him. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Caleb picked up his hat and settled it on his head. "My mother died when I was young. My father remarried a woman who saw me as free labor and nothing more. When I was old enough, I left. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone trapped the way I was, I would." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm staying at the boarding house on Maple Street tonight. If you decide to come to the ranch, meet me there at dawn. If not—" He shrugged. "I hope you find something better than this town can offer." Then he was gone, leaving Eliza alone with Frank and the devastating ruins of her life. She didn't go back to their rooms. She couldn't bear the thought of spending even one more night under the same roof as Frank. Instead, she went to the small room behind the boarding house laundry where she sometimes worked late. It was cold and damp, but it had a door she could bar from the inside. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and tried to think. Dawn was perhaps 8 hours away. She had to decide what to do with the rest of her life. Stay in Coleridge? Impossible. Everyone would know what had happened. She'd always be that girl who was nearly sold. Marcus Hyde's apologetic whisper echoed in her mind. They'd all known, or suspected, and not one had stepped forward to help until Caleb Mercer appeared. Leave town alone? With what money? She had maybe $3 saved. That wouldn't get her far. Or she could accept Caleb's offer. Go to his ranch, work for him, try to build something from the wreckage. But could she trust him? He'd spent $1,500 to free her, yes, but men didn't do things like that without wanting something in return. What if his talk of freedom and choice was just a prettier way of buying her? What if she traded one trap for another? Yet something in his eyes had seemed genuine. And he'd walked away. He'd given her a choice and then left her to make it without pressure or coercion. Maybe, just maybe, there were still decent men in the world. As the night wore on and the cold seeped into her bones, Eliza made her decision. She would go to Caleb Mercer's ranch, not because she trusted him completely, but because it was the only path forward that offered any dignity. If he proved to be a liar, if he tried to claim ownership despite his words, she would run. She'd find a way. But if he was telling the truth, if he really meant to give her a chance at an honest life, then maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to being human again instead of merchandise. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, Eliza left the laundry room and walked through the quiet streets to the boarding house on Maple Street. She carried everything she owned in a small canvas bag: 2 dresses, an extra pair of stockings, her mother's wedding ring, and the book she'd borrowed from the school teacher. She'd have to mail that back someday. Caleb Mercer was already outside, checking the saddle on a large brown horse. A second horse stood nearby, saddled and ready. When he saw her, he nodded once but didn't smile. "You came," he said simply. "I came," Eliza replied. "Can you ride?" "Not well." "We'll take it slow." He gestured to the second horse. "That's Juniper. She's old and patient. She'll take care of you." Eliza approached the horse cautiously. She'd been on a horse maybe 3 times in her life, and never for more than a few minutes. Juniper turned her head to regard Eliza with one large, gentle eye and didn't seem particularly concerned. Caleb helped her mount, his hands impersonal and brief. Then he swung onto his own horse with easy grace. "It's a few hours' ride. We'll stop halfway to rest the horses. If you need to stop before that, just say so." "I'll be fine," Eliza said, though she wasn't sure that was true. They rode out of Coleridge as the sun rose over the mountains, turning the sky pink and gold. Eliza didn't look back. There was nothing in that town she wanted to remember. The ranch, when they finally reached it late that afternoon, was smaller than Eliza had expected but well kept. A sturdy log house stood in a clearing with a barn, a corral, and several other outbuildings nearby. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with early snow. The land around the ranch was mostly open grassland, broken here and there by stands of pine and aspen. It was beautiful. And it was the last place on earth Eliza had expected to end up. Caleb helped her down from the horse, and she stood on shaky legs trying to get her bearings. A man emerged from the barn, older, with gray hair and a weathered face. He stopped short when he saw Eliza. "Didn't know you were bringing company, Caleb," the man said cautiously. "This is Eliza Rowan," Caleb replied. "She's going to be working here. Eliza, this is Will Henderson. He helps with the cattle and horses." Henderson touched his hat brim. "Ma'am." Eliza managed a nod in return. "I'll show you the house," Caleb said. "Get you settled." The house was simple but clean. A main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one. 2 doors led to what Eliza assumed were bedrooms. Caleb gestured to one of these. "That'll be your room. It's not much, but it's private. There's a lock on the door, like I promised." Eliza stepped into the small room. It held a bed, a dresser, a chair, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. It was more than she'd had in Coleridge, and it was hers. Truly hers. She set down her bag and turned to find Caleb watching her from the doorway. "We'll draw up a proper contract tomorrow," he said. "Room, board, and $10 a month to start. More if the work suits. Your job will be cooking, cleaning, and general housekeeping. The work's not easy, but I don't expect more than an honest day's effort. You have Sunday afternoons free, and if you ever want to leave, you can. No strings." "Why are you doing this?" Eliza asked again. She needed to understand. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Because nobody should be treated as property," he finally said, "and because you deserve a chance to choose your own life." He stepped back from the doorway. "Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." That night, Eliza lay in her new bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind moving through the pines, the creak of the house settling. She thought about Frank, probably drunk in their rooms in Coleridge, drowning his guilt in whiskey. She thought about her mother, buried in the town cemetery, never knowing how badly things would turn out. And she thought about Caleb Mercer, the man who had given her something she'd thought was lost forever, the power to choose. She wasn't foolish enough to think everything would be easy from here. She didn't know if she could truly trust Caleb or if this new life would work out. But for the first time since her mother died, she had hope. And sometimes, hope was enough to start with. The first morning at the ranch, Eliza woke before dawn out of pure habit. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the air too clean, the silence too complete. Then memory returned in a rush. The auction, Caleb's bid, the long ride through the mountains. She was free. Or as close to free as she'd been in 3 years. She dressed quickly in the dim light and ventured out into the main room. Caleb was already up, building a fire in the large cast-iron stove. He looked up when she entered, but didn't seem surprised. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I'm used to early mornings." Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly uncertain. "I thought I'd start on breakfast." "Appreciate that, but you don't have to jump right in. Give yourself a day to settle." "I'd rather work." The truth was she needed something to do with her hands, something to focus on besides the upheaval of her entire life. "Please." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, kitchen supplies are in that cabinet. Will usually takes his breakfast around 6, and he likes his coffee strong enough to strip paint. I'm not particular." He showed her where everything was kept: flour, salt, the coffee, a good supply of eggs from the chickens she'd heard clucking outside. The kitchen was better stocked than she'd expected, and she wondered if Caleb had prepared for her arrival, or if he simply took care to keep his household running smoothly. By the time Will Henderson came in from the early chores, Eliza had biscuits in the oven, bacon sizzling in the pan, and eggs ready to crack. The old ranch hand stopped in the doorway and sniffed the air appreciatively. "Smells better than Caleb's cooking already," he said with a slight grin. "No offense, boss." "None taken," Caleb replied from where he sat at the table, working on some paperwork. "I'm the first to admit I can burn water." Will settled into a chair with a grunt. "So, Miss Rowan, you from Coleridge?" "Yes, sir." Eliza kept her attention on the stove. "Rough town. All those mining camps are. Men go a little crazy when they're underground all day." He accepted the coffee she poured with a nod of thanks. "What brought you out here, if you don't mind my asking?" There was a brief, tense silence. Eliza's hand trembled slightly as she set the coffee pot down. "She needed work, and I needed help," Caleb said evenly. "That's all that matters." Will's eyes moved between them, understanding dawning in his weathered face. He'd lived too long and seen too much to miss the signs. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, you're welcome here, miss. This is a decent place. Caleb runs an honest operation." "Thank you," Eliza managed. They ate breakfast in relative silence, though it wasn't uncomfortable. Will complimented her biscuits twice, and even Caleb admitted they were better than anything he'd managed to produce. When the meal was finished, Will headed back out to work on repairing a section of fence, and Caleb cleared his throat. "I meant what I said about drawing up a contract," he told Eliza. "I have the papers here. If you'll sit, we can go through it together." Eliza dried her hands on a towel and joined him at the table. The contract was written in clear, simple language, none of the legal tangles she'd half expected. It laid out her duties, her wages, her living arrangements. Most importantly, it included a clause stating she was free to terminate the agreement at any time with 2 weeks' notice. "Can you read?" Caleb asked, not unkindly. "Yes. My mother made sure of that." Eliza scanned the document carefully. Everything was exactly as he'd promised. This seems fair. It is fair. That's the point. He slid a pen across to her. If you're satisfied, sign at the bottom. I'll sign as witness, and we'll both have a copy. Eliza picked up the pen. Her hand hovered over the paper for just a moment. This felt real in a way yesterday hadn't. By signing this, she was committing to staying, at least for now. She was choosing this life. She signed her name in her best handwriting. Caleb signed below as witness, then made a duplicate copy for her records. Keep this somewhere safe, he advised, in case there are ever questions about your employment here. Questions from who? From anyone. His expression was serious. Eliza, I need you to understand something. What happened in Coleridge, that doesn't stay secret in small towns. People talk, and there are men who might see your presence here as an opportunity. I'll do what I can to protect you, but you need to be cautious. Don't go anywhere alone until you know the area better. If anyone bothers you, you tell me immediately. A chill ran down Eliza's spine. She'd been so focused on escaping that she hadn't fully considered what came after. Blackwood's words echoed in her memory. She has no protection once she steps outside this room. I understand, she said quietly. Good. Caleb stood and gathered his papers. I've got to ride out and check on the herd today. Will can handle things here, but if you need anything, he'll help. Otherwise, just get familiar with the house and the routine. There's no rush. After he left, Eliza spent the morning exploring her new surroundings. The house was simple but well built, with sturdy furniture and everything in its place. Caleb's bedroom was as Spartan as a monk's cell, just a bed, a dresser, and a trunk. No pictures, no decorations, nothing personal except a Bible on the bedside table. She cleaned the house thoroughly, partly because it needed it, and partly because the work settled her nerves. She found a rhythm in sweeping floors and washing windows, in scrubbing pots and folding linens. Physical labor had always been her refuge. Will came in for lunch, cold biscuits and leftover bacon, and they ate together at the kitchen table. He was easier to talk to than Caleb, more naturally friendly, and he seemed genuinely pleased to have another person around the ranch. Gets lonely out here sometimes, he admitted. Caleb's good company, but he's not much for conversation. Keeps things to himself, always has. How long have you worked for him? Going on 5 years now. He bought this place when he was just 25, built it up from nothing. Most folks thought he was crazy. Land out here's hard, winters are brutal, and the nearest town's a half-day's ride. But Caleb, he's stubborn. Once he sets his mind to something, there's no talking him out of it. Eliza thought about the auction, about Caleb calmly bidding $1,500 he probably couldn't afford to spare. Yes, she said softly. I'm beginning to see that. He's a good man, Will continued. One of the best I've known. Whatever brought you here, miss, you made the right choice coming to work for him. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe she'd finally found a safe harbor after 3 years of storms. But trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. The afternoon passed quietly. Eliza prepared supper. Venison stew from meat she found in the cold cellar. More biscuits, canned green beans from the supply pantry. When Caleb returned just before sunset, tired and dusty, he looked genuinely surprised to find a hot meal waiting. You didn't have to do all this, he said, washing his hands at the basin. It's my job now, Eliza replied simply. Over dinner, Caleb told them about the herd. Everything looked good, no signs of illness, and the calves born in spring were growing strong. Will mentioned the fence repairs were nearly finished. They talked around Eliza as if she'd always been there, and gradually she found herself relaxing, even offering a comment or two about supplies they were running low on. After the meal, while Eliza cleaned up, Caleb sat by the fire with a book. Not the Bible, but a worn copy of something by James Fenimore Cooper. He read in silence, and Eliza found something comforting about his presence, steady, undemanding, simply there. When she finished the dishes, she said goodnight and retreated to her room. She locked the door as Caleb had promised she could, then sat on her bed and let out a long, shaky breath. One day done, a beginning. The first week passed in a similar pattern. Eliza cooked and cleaned, learned where everything was kept, and how Caleb preferred things done. He and Will were gone most days working the ranch, returning tired and hungry. The routine was comforting in its predictability. On Sunday afternoon, Caleb reminded her that she had the time off as agreed. Will and I can manage our own meals today. You should rest." But Eliza didn't know what to do with rest. She'd spent years working every waking hour, and idleness made her nervous. Instead, she walked the perimeter of the ranch, familiarizing herself with the land. The mountains loomed in the distance, already heavy with snow on their peaks. Winter would come early this year, she thought. She found a small creek running through the property, cold and clear. Aspens clustered along its banks, their leaves already turning gold. It was beautiful country, harsh but beautiful. Different from the dusty streets of Coleridge, different from the orderly neighborhoods of St. Louis where she'd lived as a child. Out here the sky seemed bigger somehow, as if there was room to breathe. When she returned to the house, she found Caleb on the porch, mending a bridle. He looked up as she approached. "Find anything interesting?" "The creek, the aspens." She climbed the porch steps. "It's pretty here." "It is." He went back to his work. "Hard, but pretty." Eliza leaned against the porch railing, gathering her courage. "Mr. Mercer, I wanted to thank you for what you did in Coleridge." "Call me Caleb, and you don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You spent a fortune to help someone you didn't know. That's not something I can just forget." His hand stilled on the leather. "I told you why I did it." "You told me about your stepmother, but that doesn't explain spending $1,500. Caleb set down the bridle and looked out at the mountains. For a long moment he was silent. Then, "My father was a drunk. Not mean, just useless. My stepmother ran everything, and she worked me like a dog from the time I was 10. No school, no childhood, just work. When I was 16, I ran away, lived rough for a few years, did odd jobs, saved every penny, eventually bought this land." He paused. "The first time I slept in a bed I'd paid for myself. In a house I owned, I cried. Grown man crying like a baby, because I was finally free." Eliza's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It made me who I am." He finally looked at her. "When I heard what was happening to you, I saw myself. I had the money and the means to help, so I did. It's that simple." $1,500 isn't simple. "It's just money. You can always make more money." His gaze was steady. "But you only get one life. One chance at freedom. That's worth more than any amount of dollars." Eliza found she had no response to that. She simply nodded and went inside, blinking back unexpected tears. The second week, supplies ran low and Caleb announced they needed to make a trip to town. Not Coleridge, he wouldn't take her back there, but to a smaller settlement called Pine Ridge about 15 miles west. It was barely more than a trading post and a few scattered buildings, but they could get what they needed. "You don't have to come," Caleb said. "Will can stay here with you if you'd rather." But Eliza needed to prove to herself that she could face the world again. "I'll come." They left early on a cool morning, taking the wagon this time instead of horses. The road was rough but passable, cutting through pine forests and across open meadows. Caleb didn't talk much, but his silence was comfortable rather than awkward. Pine Ridge was exactly as small as promised. A general store, a blacksmith, a tiny church, and a handful of houses. The store's proprietor, a jovial man named Tucker, greeted Caleb warmly. "Haven't seen you in a month of Sundays. How's the herd?" "Good. Tucker, this is Miss Eliza Rowan. She's working at my place now." Tucker's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too polite to comment. "Pleased to meet you, miss. You let me know if Caleb's not treating you right. We don't tolerate that sort of thing out here." "He's been nothing but kind," Eliza said quickly. They spent an hour in the store, selecting supplies. Caleb let Eliza choose what she needed for the kitchen and didn't question her selections. When she picked up a small sack of sugar, though, he cleared his throat. "Get 2. You'll need it for preserving, and Christmas isn't far off." Christmas. Eliza hadn't thought that far ahead. Would she still be here in 2 months? 3? Would this arrangement actually last, or would something happen to shatter this fragile new life? As they were loading the wagon, a woman approached from the church across the road. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Caleb Mercer," she called out. "I heard you were in town." "Mrs. Patterson." Caleb touched his hat. "How are you?" "Well enough." "And who is this?" She smiled at Eliza. "Eliza Rowan. She's my new housekeeper." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted slightly. Not unkind, but knowing. In a place this small, news traveled. She'd heard something, Eliza realized. Maybe not the whole story, but enough. Well, Miss Rowan, I hope Caleb's taking proper care of you. He's a good man, but men living alone sometimes forget the niceties. She turned to Caleb. You should bring her to church services. We meet every other Sunday. I'll keep that in mind, Caleb said non-committally. On the ride back, Eliza worked up the courage to ask, Does everyone know about Coleridge? Caleb was quiet for a moment. News travels. People talk. But most folks out here mind their own business. They judge you by your work and your character, not by what happened to you. He glanced at her. Anyone who doesn't think that way isn't worth your concern. And if they come from Coleridge, if they try to... She couldn't finish the sentence. They won't. His voice was hard. And if they try, they'll answer to me. The third week brought the first real snow. It started as light flurries that dusted the ground, then built into a serious storm that lasted 2 days. Eliza had never experienced a mountain winter, and she watched from the window with growing anxiety as the snow piled higher. We'll be snowed in soon, Will told her matter-of-factly. Once the real cold hits, we won't get to town again until spring. That's why Caleb keeps such good stores laid in. Until spring? Eliza felt a flutter of panic. That's months. 4 or 5, usually. You get used to it. He pulled on his heavy coat. Excuse me, miss, but I need to help Caleb move the herd closer to the barn. They'll need shelter when this really hits. Eliza spent the day cooking and baking, preparing as much as she could while they still had fresh ingredients. She made bread, biscuits, pies, a huge pot of stew. Caleb and Will came in half frozen around sunset, and the sight of the warm food seemed to lift their spirits. You're an angel, Will said, warming his hands around a mug of coffee. Swear to God, an angel. Even Caleb smiled slightly. He's right. This is good work, Eliza. That night, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, the three of them sat by the fire. Will told stories about his years working various ranches, about cattle drives and close calls with rustlers. Caleb listened and occasionally added a detail or correction. Eliza simply listened, grateful for the warmth and the company. You ever been in a real blizzard, miss? Will asked her. No. Is this one? This? Will laughed. This is just a taste. Wait until January. That's when the real storms hit. Snow so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. Cold that'll freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. You're scaring her, Caleb said mildly. Just preparing her. She should know what's coming. I'll be fine, Eliza said, with more confidence than she felt. I've weathered hard things before. Will and Caleb exchanged a glance. That you have, miss, Will said quietly. That you have. By the end of the first month, Eliza had settled into something resembling routine. She knew how Caleb liked his coffee, how Will preferred his eggs, when to expect them back from working the ranch. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck in its frame, where mice tried to get into the pantry. The ranch was beginning to feel less like a refuge and more like home. She was mending one of Caleb's shirts one evening when he came in early, looking troubled. Will had already gone to his small cabin behind the barn. He preferred his privacy in the evenings. Something wrong? Eliza asked. Caleb hung up his coat and hat, then sat heavily at the table. Ran into someone from Coleridge today. Man named Garrett does some surveying work in the area. Eliza's hands stilled on the mending. What did he say? Asked about you. Said folks in town were talking about how you disappeared. Some think you ran off on your own. Some think you might have met with foul play. He looked at her directly. And some know exactly what happened and where you are. Frank? No. Frank left town a week after that night. Nobody knows where he went, but others know. Blackwood knows. Caleb leaned forward, his expression serious. Garrett said Blackwood's been making noise about the auction being irregular. Says I interfered with a legitimate business transaction. That's ridiculous. He took your money. He did. But he's a powerful man used to getting his way, and he doesn't like being made to look foolish. I don't think he'll actually do anything. It would cost him more than it's worth. But I wanted you to know there might be trouble. Eliza set down the mending with shaking hands. Maybe I should leave. Go somewhere else. Somewhere far away where nobody knows. No. Caleb's voice was firm. Running won't solve anything. Blackwood has connections everywhere. Besides, you have a legal contract to work here. He'd have to prove you were somehow his property, which he can't do. He paused. Unless you want to leave. That's always your choice. Did she want to leave? A month ago, she would have said she couldn't imagine staying, but now, with the routine established and the ranch feeling familiar, the thought of starting over somewhere else was exhausting. I want to stay, she said quietly. If you'll still have me, then you'll stay. Caleb stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. There's something else you should know. Garrett said Marcus Hyde has been asking questions about you too. Mr. Hyde, the store owner? The same. His wife's been sick, took a bad turn about 2 weeks ago. Garrett says Hyde mentioned several times that you used to do their laundry, said his wife. Always liked you, wondered if you might be persuaded to come help nurse her. Eliza remembered Mrs. Hyde, a gentle woman with a quick smile and kind words. She'd always treated Eliza with respect, never like just the help. Is she very ill? Sounds like it might be consumption. She's not expected to last the winter. That's terrible. Eliza felt a pang of sympathy. If she needs help, you're not going back to Coleridge, Caleb said flatly. Not for any reason. It's too dangerous. But if Mrs. Hyde is dying, then her husband can hire one of the women in town to help. His tone softened slightly. I understand you want to help, but Eliza, Hyde was at that auction. He bid on you. Whatever his intentions were, he was part of it. You don't owe him or his wife anything. Eliza wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Going back to Coleridge would be foolish. Still, the news about Mrs. Hyde sat heavy on her conscience. That night, she had trouble sleeping. She kept thinking about Mrs. Hyde's kind face, about the extra food she'd always pressed into Eliza's hands. You're too thin, dear. Take this home. She'd been one of the few bright spots in Coleridge, and now she was dying. Around midnight, Eliza gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen for some water. She was surprised to find Caleb there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, papers spread in front of him. Can't sleep either? He asked. No. Eliza poured her water and hesitated. May I ask you something? Of course. How did you know? That night at the auction. How did you know to come? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Will has a friend who works at the Silver Spur. He heard Blackwood's man setting up the auction, heard them talking about some girl. He came and told Will, and Will told me. He looked up at her. I knew Frank Gaines by reputation. I knew he had a stepdaughter. It wasn't hard to put it together what was happening. So you came to stop it. I came because someone needed to. He gathered his papers. I'm not a hero, Eliza. I'm just a man who had more money than sense that particular night. You had more decency than every other man in that room combined, Eliza said quietly. That counts for something. Maybe. He stood. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I need to ride out and check on the winter feed supplies. Caleb? She stopped him before he could leave. Thank you for telling me about Blackwood and Mr. Hyde, for being honest with me. He nodded once and retreated to his room, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with her thoughts. The next morning brought news that changed everything. They were finishing breakfast when a rider appeared, pushing his horse hard through the fresh snow. Caleb went out to meet him, and Eliza watched through the window as they talked. The rider looked agitated, gesturing emphatically. Caleb's expression grew darker by the moment. When he came back inside, his jaw was set tight. That was Tom Garrett again. There's been trouble in Coleridge. What kind of trouble? Marcus Hyde is dead. Shot 3 nights ago outside the Silver Spur. Sheriff's calling it robbery, but Garrett says it looks like an execution. He pulled on his coat. I need to ride over to Pine Ridge and send some telegrams, make sure we're on record about your employment here. If there's any question about what happened, do you think someone killed him because of me? Eliza felt sick. I think Hyde was asking too many questions, and someone didn't like it. Might have nothing to do with you. Might have everything to do with you. Caleb settled his hat on his head. Either way, it's a reminder that Blackwood doesn't like loose ends. Will's going to stay here with you while I'm gone. Don't open the door for anyone except him or me. Understood? Yes. I mean it, Eliza. Anyone. I don't care if it's Mrs. Patterson from the church or the territorial governor. Nobody comes in until I get back. After he left, the house felt too quiet. Eliza tried to keep busy with her usual work, but her mind kept returning to Marcus Hyde lying dead in the street. Had he died because he asked questions about her? Had his concern for his dying wife's wish to see Eliza cost him his life? Will came in for lunch and tried to ease her worry. Don't assume the worst. Men get shot all the time in places like Coal Ridge. Could have been a genuine robbery. But you don't believe that. I don't know what to believe, but I know Caleb will handle it. He's got a good head on his shoulders. Caleb didn't return until after dark. He looked exhausted and cold, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Sent telegrams to the territorial marshal and to a lawyer friend in Denver. Made sure there's a clear record that you're employed here legally, that you left Coleridge of your own free will, and that any claims against you are without merit. Will it help? It gives us documentation if we need it, and it sends a message that you're not unprotected. He accepted the coffee Eliza poured for him gratefully. The marshal wired back that he'd look into Hyde's death. Probably won't come to anything, but at least it's on record. What about Mrs. Hyde, with her husband dead? She died 2 days ago, before Hyde was shot. Caleb's expression was grim. He buried her in the morning, got drunk that afternoon, started asking questions about you that evening, and was dead by midnight. The timing's suspicious as hell. Eliza sank into a chair, overwhelmed. 2 people dead, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible. This isn't your fault, Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts. Hyde made his own choices, so did whoever killed him. You're a victim in this, not a culprit. It doesn't feel that way. I know, but it's the truth. He finished his coffee and stood. I'm going to talk to Will, make sure we're keeping extra watch for a while. You should get some rest. But rest didn't come easy that night, or many nights after. Eliza lay awake wondering if someone would come for her, if Blackwood would decide she was too much of a liability to leave alone. Every sound outside made her jump, every shadow seemed threatening. A week passed, then 2. No one came. The snow continued to fall, piling higher, isolating the ranch from the rest of the world. Gradually, Eliza's fear began to ease. Maybe Blackwood had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe Hyde's death really had been unrelated. Maybe she was finally, truly safe. She should have known better than to hope. It was a bright, cold morning in early December when they came. Eliza was alone in the house. Caleb and Will had gone to check on some cattle reported to be straying too far from shelter. She was kneading bread dough when she heard horses outside. 3 men. She recognized one immediately, the thin man from the auction, Blackwood's lawyer. The other 2 were hired muscle, hard-faced men with guns on their hips. Her first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The windows were frozen shut, and her room wouldn't provide any real protection. Instead, she grabbed the rolling pin from the counter, a pathetic weapon, but better than nothing, and stood behind the door as they knocked. Miss Rowan? The thin man's voice was polite as ever. We need to speak with you. Open up, please. She didn't answer. Miss Rowan, we know you're in there. Mr. Mercer's been seen riding out. You're alone. We just want to talk. The hell they did. Eliza's hands tightened on the rolling pin. We can do this the easy way, or the hard way, one of the other men growled. Your choice. There was a moment of silence, then a tremendous crash as they kicked in the door. It flew open, slamming against the wall. The thin man entered first, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Eliza. There you are. Put down the... He caught sight of the rolling pin and smiled. Really? That's your weapon of choice? Get out. Eliza's voice shook but held firm. You have no right to be here. We have every right. You're coming back to Coleridge to answer some questions about Marcus Hyde's death. I was here when he died. I haven't been to Coleridge in over a month. Nevertheless, the sheriff wants to talk to you, as a witness. The thin man gestured to his companions. Take her. The 2 men moved forward. Eliza swung the rolling pin at the first one, catching him across the arm. He swore and backhanded her, sending her sprawling. The rolling pin clattered to the floor. Careful, the thin man said mildly. Mr. Blackwood wants her undamaged. They grabbed her arms, hauling her upright. Eliza fought, kicking and scratching, but they were too strong. One of them twisted her arm behind her back until she cried out in pain. "Stop struggling," the thin man advised. "You'll only hurt yourself." They were dragging her toward the door when a shot rang out. Everyone froze. Caleb stood in the doorway, rifle raised, his face a mask of cold fury. Will was behind him, also armed. Both weapons were pointed directly at the intruders. "Let her go," Caleb said quietly. "Now." The thin man's smile didn't falter. "Mr. Mercer, how fortunate. We were just—" "I said let her go." Caleb's finger moved to the trigger. "Or I'll kill you where you stand. Your choice." The thin man's smile finally faltered. His eyes darted between Caleb's rifle and the deadly serious expression on his face. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was Eliza's ragged breathing and the wind howling outside. "This is a legal matter," the thin man said carefully. "The sheriff of Coleridge has questions about Marcus Hyde's murder. Surely you don't want to interfere with a lawful investigation." "I don't see any sheriff here," Caleb's voice was ice. "I see 3 men who broke into my home and put their hands on my employee. That's assault and trespassing. Under territorial law, I'm within my rights to shoot all 3 of you and let the marshal sort it out later." The man holding Eliza's arm released her slowly. She stumbled forward, and Will moved quickly to catch her, pulling her behind him while keeping his rifle trained on the intruders. "Mr. Mercer, be reasonable," the thin man tried again. "Mr. Blackwood simply wants to ensure there are no loose ends regarding Hyde's death. The man was asking questions about Miss Rowan the night he died. Naturally, that creates suspicion." "Suspicion about what? Eliza was here, on my ranch, the night Hyde died." "I'll swear to that under oath. So will Will Henderson. We have nothing to hide." Caleb took a step forward, and the 3 men instinctively backed toward the door. "But I'll tell you what I do find suspicious. Hyde gets shot hours after asking about Eliza, and now you show up claiming the sheriff wants to question her, but you didn't bring the sheriff. You didn't bring any legal papers. You just kicked in my door and tried to kidnap her." "Kidnap is a strong word. What would you call it?" Caleb's eyes were hard. "You forced your way into my home. You assaulted Miss Rowan. You were dragging her out against her will. That's kidnapping in any court in the territory." The thin man's composure was cracking. "Mr. Blackwood won't like this." "I don't care what Blackwood likes or doesn't like. He took my money at that auction. That made Eliza a free woman. He has no claim on her. None. And if he sends anyone else out here to bother her, I'll shoot first and answer questions later. You make sure he understands that." One of the hired men, the one Eliza had hit with the rolling pin, spoke up. "You can't guard her forever, Mercer. Winter's coming. You'll be snowed in. Anything could happen." "Is that a threat?" Will's voice was deadly calm. "Just a fact." "Here's another fact," Caleb said. "I've sent documentation to the territorial marshal about Eliza's employment here. I filed papers with a lawyer in Denver. If anything happens to her or to me or to Will, those papers will be opened, and they detail everything, the auction, Blackwood's involvement, all of it. You want that kind of attention from the marshal's office?" The thin man's jaw tightened. He clearly hadn't expected this level of preparation. Mr. Blackwood was simply trying to resolve a potential complication. "Eliza isn't a complication. She's a person with legal rights. Now get off my property before I forget I'm a civilized man." The 3 men exchanged glances. The thin man gave a curt nod, and they backed out through the broken doorway. Caleb and Will kept their rifles raised until the men had mounted their horses and ridden away, disappearing into the snow-covered landscape. Only then did Caleb lower his weapon. He turned to Eliza, and his expression shifted from cold fury to concern. "Are you hurt?" Eliza touched her cheek where she'd been struck. It was already swelling. "I'm all right, just shaken." "Will, start nailing boards over that door. I'll check the perimeter, make sure they're really gone." Caleb caught Eliza's arm gently as she swayed. "Sit down before you fall down. That's an order." She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her trembling and sick. Will immediately set to work repairing the door while Caleb grabbed his heavy coat and headed outside. When he returned 20 minutes later, his face was grim. They rode south, back toward Coleridge, But they'll be back, or someone else will. Blackwood doesn't give up this easily. Maybe I should leave, Eliza said quietly. Go to Denver or California or… No. Caleb pulled off his coat and hung it up. Running won't help. Blackwood has reach. He could find you anywhere in the territory, maybe beyond, and you'd be alone, vulnerable. He sat down across from her. Here, you have protection. You have witnesses. You have legal documentation of your status. We stand a better chance fighting him here than you do running. But they threatened you, both of you. I can't ask you to risk your lives for me. Will finished hammering the last board into place and turned around. You're not asking, miss. We're choosing. Big difference. Will's right, Caleb said. This isn't just about you anymore. Blackwood kicked in my door, assaulted someone under my protection, threatened us. That makes it personal. He doesn't get to do that and walk away. Eliza looked between the two men, seeing the determination in their faces. What do we do? We get ready, Caleb said simply. We prepare for the possibility they'll come back. We make sure we're never caught off guard again. And we document everything that happens, every threat, every attempt. Build a case so strong that even Blackwood's money and influence can't overcome it. Over the next few days, they turned the ranch into something of a fortress. Caleb and Will took turns keeping watch, especially at night. They moved extra weapons into the house and made sure Eliza knew how to use them. Caleb taught her to load and fire a rifle, though her hands shook so badly the first time that she could barely pull the trigger. It gets easier, he told her. I hope you never have to use it in earnest, but if it comes to that, I want you able to defend yourself. They also established protocols. Eliza was never to answer the door without checking who was outside first. If Caleb and Will were both gone, she was to bar the door and not open it for anyone, regardless of what they claimed. They worked out signals, specific patterns of knocking so Eliza would know it was safe to open up. A week passed with no further incidents. Then another. The snow continued to pile up, and true winter set in with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted. The wind screamed down from the mountains like something alive and angry. They were effectively cut off from the outside world now. Eliza found the isolation both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant Blackwood's men couldn't easily reach them. Terrifying because if something did happen, there would be no help coming. Christmas approached, bringing with it a strange sense of normalcy. Will cut down a small pine tree and brought it inside, and Eliza decorated it with strings of popcorn and dried cranberries. She baked cookies and a proper ham, using the last of their fresh meat before it would have to be salted. On Christmas Eve, the three of them sat by the fire, and Will told stories about Christmases past while Caleb read from the Bible. It was peaceful, almost family-like. Eliza felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Not quite happiness, because fear still lurked in the back of her mind, but something close to contentment. For the first time in years, she wasn't spending Christmas afraid and alone. Caleb caught her eye across the firelight and smiled slightly. What are you thinking? That this is nice, she admitted. That I didn't expect to feel safe this Christmas. You are safe, he said firmly. I promise you that. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that promise with everything she had. But she'd learned the hard way that safety was fragile and easily shattered. Still, she smiled back. Thank you. For everything. The new year arrived quietly. They marked it with a special dinner and a toast to better times ahead. January brought the worst storms yet, blizzards that lasted days and left snow piled so high against the house that they had to dig themselves out each morning. The work was brutal and endless, keeping the animals fed and sheltered, maintaining the house, ensuring they didn't run low on firewood or food. But through it all, Eliza felt herself growing stronger. The physical labor toughened her, the routine gave her purpose, and the knowledge that Caleb and Will trusted her, relied on her, gave her a sense of worth she'd lost somewhere along the way. She also found herself watching Caleb more closely, noticing things she'd been too frightened or overwhelmed to see before. The way he always made sure she had enough food before taking his own share. How he'd quietly replaced her worn boots with new ones, claiming someone had left them at the ranch years ago. The careful way he spoke to her, never demanding or commanding, always asking and giving her the choice. He was, she realized, genuinely kind. Not weak, he'd proven his strength when Blackwood's men came, but kind in a way that came from deep conviction rather than mere politeness. He treated her as an equal, valued her opinions, never made her feel like a burden despite the trouble she'd brought to his door. One evening in mid-January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Eliza worked up the courage to voice something that had been on her mind. "Caleb, can I ask you something personal?" He looked up from the harness he was mending. "Of course. Why haven't you married? A man with a ranch like this, you could have your pick of women." Will snorted from his chair in the corner. "He's been asked that question 100 times. Good luck getting a straight answer." Caleb shot him an amused look, then turned back to Eliza. "I suppose because I haven't met anyone I wanted to marry. This life is hard. The winters are brutal, the work never ends, and you're isolated for months at a time. Most women wouldn't want that." "Some would," Eliza said quietly. "For the right man." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or interest, but it was gone before she could identify it. "Maybe someday," he said, "when things are more settled." The conversation moved on, but Eliza caught Will watching her with a knowing expression. Later, when Caleb had gone outside to check on the livestock, Will spoke quietly. "He's a good man, miss. Best I've known. But he's careful. Doesn't let people in easy." He paused. "Of course, he let you in faster than I've ever seen. Make of that what you will." Eliza didn't know what to make of it. She didn't trust her own judgment anymore when it came to men. Frank had seemed decent enough at first, and look how that turned out. How could she be sure Caleb was different? How could she trust these feelings growing inside her, gratitude mixing with something warmer, something that made her heart beat faster when he smiled at her? February brought a brief thaw, and with it, news from the outside world. A rider from Pine Ridge made it through with mail and supplies. Among the letters was one for Caleb, and his expression darkened as he read it. "What is it?" Eliza asked. "Blackwood's been making official complaints to the territorial government, claims I'm harboring a material witness to a murder, says I'm interfering with justice." Caleb tossed the letter on the table. "It's all lies, but he's got friends in high places. This could get complicated." "What do we do?" "My lawyer friend in Denver sent this as a warning. He says we need to be prepared to present our case if a marshal comes out. He's drafting a formal response outlining everything, the auction, Blackwood's attempt to kidnap you, all of it. But it's going to take time." "How much time?" "Weeks, maybe months. The territorial government moves slowly." Caleb looked at her seriously. "Eliza, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. If a marshal does come, if this goes to some kind of hearing, are you prepared to testify about what happened, about the auction, about Frank, all of it?" The thought of standing in a courtroom telling strangers about the worst night of her life made Eliza's stomach turn, but she nodded. "If I have to, yes." "It won't be easy. Blackwood's lawyers will try to make you look bad, suggest you were complicit somehow. They'll dig into your past, your character. It won't be pleasant." "Nothing about this has been pleasant," Eliza said quietly. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. If we have to fight, then we fight." Pride flickered across Caleb's face. "All right then. We'll be ready." The thaw lasted only a few days before winter returned with renewed fury. More snow, more bitter cold, more isolation. But this time, Eliza felt prepared. She knew what they were up against, and she knew she wasn't alone. Late one night in early March, Eliza woke to the sound of voices outside. She froze, listening. Men's voices, low and urgent. She grabbed the rifle Caleb had insisted she keep by her bed and crept to the window. In the moonlight, she could see shapes moving near the barn. At least 4 men, maybe more. They were trying to be quiet, but the snow crunched under their feet. One carried what looked like a torch. Fire. They were going to burn the barn. Eliza didn't hesitate. She ran to Caleb's room and pounded on the door. "Caleb! Men outside! They're going to burn the barn!" He was up and armed in seconds. Will appeared from his cabin, also alerted by the noise. The 3 of them moved to the windows, watching the intruders. "How many?" Caleb asked quietly. "At least 4, maybe 6. Too many to take on directly. We need to scare them off." Caleb moved to the door. "Will, cover me from the window." "Eliza, you stay inside and keep watch. If anyone tries to get in the house, shoot them." "Caleb, wait." But he was already slipping outside into the darkness. Eliza positioned herself at the window, rifle ready, her heart hammering. She watched Caleb move like a shadow toward the barn. One of the intruders had already lit his torch and was moving toward the barn wall when Caleb fired. The shot cracked through the night air. The man with the torch fell, clutching his leg and screaming. The others scattered, diving for cover. Another shot from Will's position dropped a second man. "Next one goes through someone's head." Caleb's voice rang out. "Leave now or die here!" There was chaos in the darkness, shouts, the sound of horses being mounted. The intruders who could still move were fleeing, leaving their wounded behind. Caleb waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before approaching the two men on the ground. Eliza watched through the window as he checked them. One was unconscious, shot through the shoulder. The other, the one with the leg wound, was awake and groaning. Caleb hauled him upright roughly. "Who sent you?" "Go to hell," the man spat. Caleb pressed his rifle against the man's wounded leg, and the man screamed. "Who sent you?" "Blackwood. Blackwood sent us. We were supposed to burn you out, make it look like an accident." "How much did he pay you?" $50 each. We just wanted the money. We didn't—" The man's voice dissolved into groans of pain. Will came out and helped Caleb drag both wounded men into the barn, where they could be secured. When they finally came back to the house, Caleb's face was grim. "This is it," he said. "Blackwood's done playing games. He's trying to kill us now." "What do we do?" Eliza felt cold despite the fire. "We ride to Pine Ridge at first light, get word to the marshal, to my lawyer, to anyone who'll listen. This is attempted murder. Even Blackwood can't buy his way out of that." Caleb began gathering supplies. "Will, can you handle the wounded men?" "I'll keep them alive. Can't promise more than that." "That's all I need. Eliza, pack a bag. Enough for a few days. You're coming with me. I'm not leaving you here alone." "But the ranch?" "The ranch can wait." "You can't." He looked at her, and his expression softened slightly. "I promised you'd be safe. I meant it, even if it means abandoning everything I've built here." Those words hit Eliza harder than any blow. He was willing to give up his ranch, his home, his livelihood, everything he'd worked for, to keep her safe. The weight of that sacrifice was almost unbearable. "I can't let you do that," she whispered. "It's not your decision. It's mine." He touched her shoulder briefly. "Go pack. We leave at dawn." They rode out as the sun rose, the landscape stark and beautiful in the early light. The journey to Pine Ridge was slow going through the deep snow, but they made it by late afternoon. Caleb went immediately to the general store, where Tucker had the only telegraph in town. While Caleb sent his messages, Eliza waited with Mrs. Patterson, who'd invited her in for tea when she saw her in town. The older woman didn't ask many questions, but her kindness was evident in every gesture. The warm blanket she wrapped around Eliza's shoulders, the hot tea liberally sweetened with honey, the gentle conversation about nothing in particular. "You're in trouble, aren't you, dear?" Mrs. Patterson finally said. Eliza saw no point in lying. "Yes, ma'am." "The kind of trouble a body can't run from?" "I've tried running. It doesn't help." Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the only way out is through. My late husband used to say that. Said it about winter storms, about droughts, about all manner of difficulties. The only way out is through." She patted Eliza's hand. "You seem like a strong girl, and Caleb Mercer's a strong man. Between you, you'll find your way through." When Caleb returned, his expression was cautiously hopeful. "The marshal's office responded. They're sending someone out, should be here within the week. My lawyer's also on his way from Denver. We'll have backup soon." "What do we do until then?" "We stay here. Tucker's offered us rooms above the store. We'll be safer here than at the ranch, at least until we know what Blackwood's planning next." The wait was agonizing. Every day felt like a week. Eliza helped Mrs. Patterson with various tasks around the church, grateful for something to occupy her hands and mind. Caleb spent his time with Tucker and some of the other men in town, quietly building support for their case. On the 5th day, a man in a brown suit arrived in town, riding a tired horse. He introduced himself as Marshal James Cartwright, and he wanted to hear everything. They spent hours in Tucker's store, the marshal taking notes as Caleb explained the situation. Eliza had to recount the night of the auction, every humiliating detail. She had to describe Blackwood's men breaking into the ranch, their attempt to kidnap her, the attack on the barn. Through it all, Marshal Cartwright listened without expression, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they finished, he sat back and studied them both. "This is quite an accusation you're making. Silas Blackwood is a powerful man with significant influence in the territory." "I know who he is," Caleb said, "and I know what he did. I have witnesses, documentation, physical evidence. This isn't an accusation, it's fact." "The 2 men you shot, they still alive?" "Last I heard. Will's keeping them at the ranch. I'll need to question them, and I'll need to ride out to your ranch, see this evidence for myself." The marshal stood. "In the meantime, Miss Rowan stays in protective custody. I can't have Blackwood's men snatching her before she can testify." "Testify?" Eliza's voice came out small. "There's going to be a trial?" "If the evidence supports it, yes. Attempted kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy, these are serious charges. If I can make them stick, Blackwood's going to prison." Marshal Cartwright looked at her with something like sympathy. "I know this is hard, miss, but sometimes the law actually works the way it's supposed to. We just need you to be brave a little longer." The marshal rode out to the ranch the next day with several deputies. Eliza waited in Pine Ridge, staying in the room above the store, barely sleeping. Caleb stayed with her, keeping watch, his presence both comforting and confusing. She was aware of him constantly, the sound of his breathing, the way he'd check the locks on the doors and windows, how he'd startle at every unexpected noise. On the second night, unable to sleep, Eliza found Caleb sitting by the small stove, staring into the flames. She joined him quietly. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much thinking." "I know the feeling." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Eliza spoke. "Caleb, why did you really do it? Why did you bid on me that night?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I saw you standing there terrified but trying not to show it. And I saw those men looking at you like you were a thing to be bought and used. And I thought about my mother, who died when I was young. About my stepmother, who treated me like property. About all the people in the world who get trampled because they're powerless." He looked at her. "I had power that night. I had money and the means to help. How could I not?" "But you didn't just help. You changed your whole life. You've put everything at risk. Your ranch, your safety, maybe even your life. What's the point of having a life if you don't use it for something that matters?" He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Eliza, you matter. Your freedom matters. Your dignity matters. That's worth fighting for." Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me. Just live, Eliza. Be free. Be happy. That's repayment enough." She found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something she couldn't name. His hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle and warm. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. For a moment she wanted him to. But he pulled back, clearing his throat. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow might be a long day." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. Something fragile and new and terrifying. Marshal Cartwright returned 3 days later with news. "I've got enough evidence to arrest Blackwood. The 2 men you shot both talked, gave detailed statements about who hired them and what they were paid to do. Combined with the testimony from Coleridge about the auction, we've got a solid case." "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "Now I ride to Coleridge with my deputies and bring Blackwood in. There'll be a preliminary hearing probably next month. You'll both need to testify." He looked at Eliza. "Miss Rowan, I want you to know this is going to be difficult. Blackwood's lawyers will try to discredit you, make you look like you're lying or exaggerating. They'll bring up your stepfather, your circumstances, everything they can use against you. Are you prepared for that?" Eliza thought about everything she'd survived. Her mother's death, Frank's betrayal, the auction, the attacks. She'd come through all of it. She could survive a courtroom. "I'm prepared," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Marshal Cartwright nodded approvingly. "Good. You've got courage, miss. That'll serve you well." He turned to Caleb. "Mercer, I'm grateful for your cooperation. Not many men would take the risks you have. The territory needs more people like you." After the marshal left to make his arrest, Caleb and Eliza returned to the ranch. Spring was finally beginning to show itself, patches of bare ground appearing where the snow melted. the first hints of green in the meadows. The damage from the attempted arson was minimal, and Will had kept everything running smoothly in their absence. "Welcome home," Will said when they arrived. "I take it things went well in town?" "Well enough," Caleb replied. "The marshal's arresting Blackwood. There'll be a trial." Will whistled low. "Never thought I'd see the day. Blackwood's had this territory under his thumb for 10 years. About time someone stood up to him." That night, as Eliza prepared supper, she found herself humming. It was a tune her mother used to sing, something about spring flowers and new beginnings. She hadn't hummed in years, hadn't felt light enough to make music. Caleb came in from washing up and stopped, listening. "Is that a song?" Eliza flushed, embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't realize I was doing it." "Don't apologize. It's nice. The house feels different with music in it." He smiled, and the warmth in his expression made her heart skip. "Feels like a home." As spring slowly reclaimed the land from winter's grip, Eliza felt something similar happening inside her. The fear and numbness that had defined her for so long were melting away, leaving room for something new to grow. Hope, maybe. Or possibility. Or something else she wasn't quite ready to name yet. But whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. And for the first time since her mother died, Eliza allowed herself to believe that good things might still be possible after all. The preliminary hearing was set for the 3rd week of April, to be held in the territorial courthouse in Leadville. It was a 3-day journey from the ranch, and Caleb insisted they leave early to allow time for any delays. Will stayed behind to manage things, though he made Caleb promise to send word as soon as the hearing concluded. The journey was unlike any Eliza had taken before. They traveled with Marshal Cartwright and 2 of his deputies, part of a small convoy that included several witnesses from Coleridge. Eliza recognized a few faces, men who'd been at the Silver Spur that night, women who'd known her from the laundry work. Most avoided her eyes, ashamed perhaps of their own complicity in what had happened. They stopped for the night at a small inn halfway to Leadville. Eliza found herself sharing a room with an older woman named Sarah Kent, who'd worked at the boarding house in Coleridge and had agreed to testify about Frank's gambling debts and the circumstances leading up to the auction. "I'm sorry I didn't help you that night," Sarah said quietly as they prepared for bed. "I knew something terrible was happening. We all knew. But we were afraid." "I understand," Eliza replied, though part of her didn't, not really. How many people had known and said nothing? How many had chosen their own safety over hers? "That Mr. Mercer of yours, though, he's something special. A man like that, willing to stand up to Blackwood, willing to risk everything for someone he barely knew." Sarah shook her head in wonder. "You hold on to him, dear. Men like that don't come along often." Eliza didn't correct the assumption that Caleb was hers. The truth was more complicated than she could explain, a tangle of gratitude and obligation, and something deeper that she was afraid to examine too closely. Leadville was bigger than Coleridge, a real city with paved streets and brick buildings. The courthouse stood at the center of town, an imposing structure that made Eliza's stomach clench with anxiety. She'd never been inside a courthouse before, never faced the machinery of justice that was supposed to protect people like her but so often failed. Caleb sensed her fear. As they climbed the courthouse steps, he took her arm gently. "You don't have to be brave," he said quietly. "You just have to be honest. Tell the truth, and let the law do the rest." "What if the truth isn't enough?" "Then we keep fighting." "But Eliza, I've seen the evidence. I've talked to the prosecutor. We have a strong case. Blackwood is going to answer for what he's done." The courtroom was already half full when they entered. Eliza saw Blackwood sitting at the defense table with 3 expensive-looking lawyers, all in fine suits. He looked older than she remembered, more fragile somehow, but his eyes were still sharp and calculating. When he saw her, his expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his gaze. The judge was a stern-faced woman named Margaret Holbrook, one of the few female judges in the territory. She had a reputation for being fair but uncompromising. When she entered and took her seat, the room fell silent. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to bind over Silas Blackwood for trial on charges of conspiracy to kidnap, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder," Judge Holbrook announced. "The prosecution will present their case, the defense will have opportunity to respond, and I will make my determination. Let's proceed." The prosecutor, a young man named Daniel Warren, stood and outlined the case methodically. He called witness after witness. The two men who'd tried to burn the ranch, both now facing their own charges and willing to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. They described in detail how Blackwood had hired them, what he'd paid them, and what he'd ordered them to do. He said the girl was trouble, one of them testified. Said she needed to be eliminated before she could cause more problems. Told us to make it look like an accident, burn the ranch with everyone inside. Blackwood's lead lawyer, a silver-haired man named Thornton, cross-examined aggressively. You expect us to believe Mr. Blackwood explicitly ordered murder? A respected businessman with no prior criminal history? That's what he said, exact words. And you have proof of this? Documents? Witnesses to these conversations? No, but so we have only your word, a convicted criminal facing prison time who conveniently implicates my client in exchange for a lighter sentence. Hardly credible testimony. The pattern repeated with each witness. Strong testimony, aggressive cross-examination, implications of ulterior motives. Eliza watched the proceedings with growing dread. The lawyers were making the truth sound like lies, making simple facts seem complicated and suspect. Then it was her turn. Prosecutor Warren called her to the stand, and Eliza walked forward on shaking legs. The bailiff swore her in, and she took her seat, acutely aware of everyone watching her. Blackwood, his lawyers, the judge, Caleb sitting in the front row with an encouraging expression. Warren started gently, establishing basic facts. Her name, her age, her residence. Then, carefully, he guided her through the story. Her mother's death, Frank's gambling, the night she came home to find strange men in their rooms. What happened next, Miss Rowan? Eliza took a deep breath. They told Frank he owed money, $300. When he said he couldn't pay, they suggested he sell me to settle the debt. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Holbrook banged her gavel once. Order. And what was Frank Gaines's response? He asked how much I would bring. Eliza's voice broke slightly. He agreed to sell me. Warren let that sit for a moment, then continued. Tell us about the auction. This was harder. Eliza had to describe walking into that room, seeing the men at the table, understanding what was happening. She had to recount the bidding, the way they discussed her like property. When she got to the part about Caleb's intervention, her voice steadied somewhat. Mr. Mercer outbid everyone. Then he said something that shocked me. He said I was free to make my own choices. He offered me employment with fair wages and my own quarters, but he made it clear I didn't have to accept. The choice was mine. And you chose to work for Mr. Mercer? Yes. Because it was the only honorable offer I'd received. Because he treated me like a human being instead of property. Warren took her through the subsequent events. Blackwood's men breaking into the ranch, the attempted kidnapping, the attack on the barn. With each incident, Eliza felt her anger growing, burning away the fear. These people had tried to rob her of her freedom, her dignity, her life. She would not let them succeed. When Warren finished, Thornton approached for cross-examination. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Miss Rowan, you've painted quite a dramatic picture, but let's examine some facts, shall we? You were living with Frank Gaines, your stepfather, without any other family or means of support. Is that correct? Yes. And you were aware of his gambling debts? I knew he gambled. I didn't know the extent of his debts until that night. But you benefited from his activities, didn't you? You lived in his home, ate food he provided. I earned my own money doing laundry. I paid for most of our food and rent. Thornton waved this away. Nevertheless, you were dependent on him. When he found himself in financial difficulty, he attempted to arrange for your future care. Perhaps not in the most conventional manner, but his intentions? Eliza's voice rose. He tried to sell me like a piece of furniture. Miss Rowan, please control yourself, Judge Holbrook said, not unkindly. Mr. Thornton, get to your point. My point, Your Honor, is that this young woman has characterized a complex financial arrangement as something sinister. My client was simply present at a gathering where this arrangement was being discussed. He placed a bid, yes, but many men did. That hardly constitutes criminal conspiracy. He sent men to kidnap me from Mr. Mercer's ranch, Eliza said flatly. They broke down the door, they put their hands on me. Is that also a complex financial arrangement? Thornton's expression hardened. You claim my client sent these men, but you have no proof, do you? You didn't hear Mr. Blackwood give any orders. You have only the word of admitted criminals seeking reduced sentences. They said his name. They said he sent them. Hearsay, not evidence. Thornton turned to the judge. Your Honor, this entire case rests on the uncorroborated testimony of criminals and a young woman who, by her own admission, was in dire financial straits. Perhaps she saw an opportunity to align herself with a wealthy rancher and concocted this story to justify the arrangement. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. That's not true. Isn't it? You're now living comfortably on Mr. Mercer's ranch, all your needs provided for. You have quite an incentive to maintain this narrative. Mr. Thornton, that's enough, Judge Holbrook said sharply. The witness has answered your questions. Do you have anything else? No, Your Honor. I believe I've made my point. Eliza returned to her seat, shaking with fury and humiliation. Caleb reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. You did well, he whispered. Don't let him get to you. That's what he wants. The hearing continued through the afternoon and into the next day. More witnesses, more testimony, more aggressive cross-examination by Thornton and his team. They painted Blackwood as a respectable businessman caught up in circumstances beyond his control, a man whose name was being dragged through the mud by criminals and opportunists. But Prosecutor Warren had one more card to play. On the second day, he called Caleb to the stand. Caleb testified clearly and without embellishment. He described hearing about the auction, attending it, and being horrified by what he witnessed. He explained his decision to bid, to free Eliza, to offer her legitimate employment. Mr. Mercer, you spent $1,500 to buy Miss Rowan's freedom. That's a substantial sum. Why? Because it was the right thing to do. Because she deserved better than what those men were planning for her. And what happened after you brought Miss Rowan to your ranch? Caleb detailed the subsequent events, the threats, the attempted kidnapping, the attack on his property. His testimony was corroborated by Will Henderson, who followed him to the stand and provided his own account. When Thornton cross-examined Caleb, he tried a different approach. Mr. Mercer, you're an unmarried man living alone on a remote ranch. When you brought Miss Rowan into your home, surely you must have considered how that would appear to others. I considered how it would appear to Miss Rowan, Caleb replied evenly. I wanted her to feel safe. Everything else was secondary. Yet you must admit, the situation is somewhat irregular. A young, attractive woman living in your home, living in her own room, working for wages under a legal contract, free to leave at any time, Caleb interrupted. There's nothing irregular about honest employment. Some might say your interest in Miss Rowan goes beyond that of an employer. Caleb was silent for a moment. Then, my interest in Miss Rowan is that she's a human being who deserves dignity and freedom. If that's somehow suspicious to you, Mr. Thornton, then I pity you. A ripple of approval ran through the courtroom. Even Judge Holbrook's stern expression softened slightly. Thornton tried a few more angles of attack, but Caleb refused to be rattled. His testimony remained consistent, his demeanor calm but firm. When he finally stepped down, Eliza felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it made her dizzy. He defended her honor, her character, her right to exist as something more than property. The hearing concluded late in the afternoon of the second day. Judge Holbrook announced she would review all testimony and evidence overnight and render her decision in the morning. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She paced her small hotel room, replaying every moment of her testimony, every accusation Thornton had made. What if the judge believed him? What if all of this, the testimony, the evidence, the courage it had taken to face Blackwood in court, what if none of it was enough? Around midnight, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Caleb standing in the hallway, still dressed, clearly unable to sleep either. I saw your light under the door, he said. Thought you might want some company. They sat in the small sitting area of the hotel, talking quietly so as not to disturb other guests. Caleb had brought coffee from the kitchen, and they shared it, the warmth welcome against the chill of the night. What happens if we lose? Eliza asked. We won't. But what if we do? What if the judge decides there's not enough evidence? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then we appeal. We take it to a higher court. We keep fighting until we win or run out of options. And if we run out of options, then we leave the territory. Go to California or Oregon, somewhere Blackwood's reach doesn't extend. Start over. He looked at her seriously. Eliza, I'm not giving up on this. I'm not giving up on you. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, you're going to be free and safe. I promise you that. You've already given up so much. Your money, your peace, your safety. How can I ask for more? You're not asking. I'm choosing. He reached over and took her hand. I need you to understand something. When I saw you in that room, surrounded by those men, I saw someone worth fighting for. And every day since, you've proven me right. Your courage, your strength, your refusal to give up. Eliza, you're remarkable. Helping you isn't a burden. It's a privilege. Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks. I don't feel remarkable. I feel scared and broken, and you're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. And you don't have to be scared alone. Not anymore. She wanted to kiss him. The impulse was sudden and overwhelming. She wanted to close the distance between them, to feel his arms around her, to stop being brave and strong for just a moment and simply let herself be held. But fear held her back. Fear that she was confusing gratitude with deeper feelings. Fear that she wasn't ready, that she might never be ready. Fear that if she reached for him and he pulled away, it would break something precious that she couldn't afford to lose. So instead, she just held his hand and whispered, "Thank you." They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just being together in the quiet darkness. Eventually, Caleb stood to leave. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, one way or another, this part will be over." But sleep still wouldn't come. Eliza lay in bed watching the hours creep by, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. When dawn finally broke, she rose exhausted but determined. Whatever happened today, she would face it with her head high. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Word had spread about the case, and it seemed like half of Leadville had come to watch the judge's ruling. Eliza took her seat beside Caleb, acutely aware of the weight of all those watching eyes. Judge Holbrook entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Her expression gave nothing away as she took her seat and arranged her papers. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this preliminary hearing," she began. "This case involves serious allegations against a prominent citizen of our territory. I don't take such allegations lightly, nor do I dismiss them simply because of the defendant's social standing." Blackwood sat motionless at his table, his lawyers flanking him like guards. "The defense has argued that the prosecution's case relies too heavily on the testimony of criminals seeking favorable treatment. However, I note that their testimonies are remarkably consistent and are corroborated by physical evidence: the damage to Mr. Mercer's property, the medical treatment required for the gunshot wounds, the documented attempts to intimidate Miss Rowan." Eliza's heart began to beat faster. "The defense has also attempted to impugn Miss Rowan's character and motives. I find these attempts unpersuasive. A young woman who has been victimized does not become less credible simply because she has found safety and employment afterward. Indeed, Mr. Mercer's actions in offering her legitimate work speak well of his character, not poorly." Judge Holbrook looked directly at Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, you participated in an event that treated a human being as property to be auctioned. You may argue this was simply a financial arrangement, but the law is clear: human beings cannot be bought and sold. When Mr. Mercer disrupted your plans, you attempted to rectify the situation through increasingly violent means." "Your Honor, I must object," Thornton began. "You'll have your chance at trial, Mr. Thornton. This is my ruling." Judge Holbrook's voice was steel. "I find that sufficient evidence exists to bind Mr. Silas Blackwood over for trial on all charges. Bail is set at $10,000. Trial date will be set for 3 months hence, to allow both sides adequate time to prepare. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through eternity. For a moment, Eliza couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then it hit her. They'd won. Not the war, not yet, but this battle. Blackwood would face trial. Justice was possible. She turned to Caleb and found him smiling, really smiling, for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "We did it," he said quietly. "Eliza, we did it." Around them, the courtroom erupted in noise, reporters rushing out to file their stories, spectators arguing about the ruling, Blackwood's lawyers huddling with their client. But Eliza only had eyes for Caleb. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words felt insufficient. How could 2 syllables contain everything she felt? Gratitude, yes, but also admiration, respect, and something deeper that she was finally ready to name. Love. She was in love with Caleb Mercer. The realization should have terrified her. After everything she'd been through, the last thing she needed was to fall for someone, to make herself vulnerable again. But somehow, with Caleb, it didn't feel like vulnerability. It felt like strength. They left the courthouse and walked through Leadville's streets, neither of them speaking much. The town was bustling with midday activity, but Eliza barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over this new understanding of her own heart. They were standing outside the hotel when Caleb turned to her. "We should head back to the ranch tomorrow. Will's probably worried sick, and there's work that needs doing. Spring planting waits for no one." "Caleb, wait." Eliza caught his arm. "There's something I need to say." He looked at her with those steady brown eyes, patient as always. "All right." She gathered her courage, the same courage that had carried her through testimony and trials. "When you made your offer that night, you said I owed you nothing, that I was free to choose my own path. That's still true. I know. But I want you to understand, I choose this. I choose working at your ranch. I choose staying." She took a breath. "I choose you." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Hope, maybe, or joy, or both. "Eliza, I know it's complicated. I know I'm probably confused and grateful and maybe not thinking clearly. But I also know that you're the best man I've ever met. You've given me back my freedom, my dignity, my life, and I want to give you something in return, if you'll have it." "What's that?" "A choice of your own." Her voice trembled slightly. "Caleb Mercer, would you consider courting me? Properly, I mean. Not employer and employee, but as equals, as 2 people who might build something together." For a long moment, Caleb didn't speak. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not just any smile, but one of pure, unguarded happiness. "Eliza Rowan, I would be honored." He took her hand, his grip warm and sure. "But I need you to know something first. If we do this, I want to do it right. I want to court you properly, give you time to be sure of your feelings, make sure you're choosing me because you want to, not because you feel obligated. I don't feel obligated. Maybe not now, but you've been through hell, and sometimes gratitude can feel like other things. I want you to have time. Time to heal, to be certain." His expression grew serious. "And Eliza, there's something else. If we court, if we eventually marry, I want it to be because we're partners, equals. Not because you need protection or security, but because we choose each other." "Is that what you want? Marriage?" "Eventually, if things work out between us." "Yes." He cupped her face gently. "But there's no rush. We have time." Except they didn't, not really. The trial was still ahead, and there was no telling what might happen. Blackwood might be convicted, or he might go free. He might accept defeat, or he might come after them again. The future was uncertain at best, dangerous at worst. But standing there with Caleb, feeling the warmth of his hand against her cheek, Eliza realized that uncertainty didn't frighten her anymore. With him beside her, she could face whatever came next. "Then let's take that time," she said. "Let's do this right." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture of promise and patience. "We will. I swear it." They returned to the ranch the next day, riding through spring landscape that was finally shaking off winter's grip. Green was returning to the meadows, wildflowers dotting the hillsides with color. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and birds filled the air with song. It felt like the world itself was celebrating their small victory. Will greeted them with obvious relief. "Thank God you're back. I was starting to think something had gone wrong." "We won the preliminary hearing," Caleb told him. There'll be a trial in 3 months, but for now, Blackwood's been put on notice. The law is taking this seriously. About damn time. Will's weathered face split in a grin. Come on inside. I've got supper ready, and you can tell me everything. That night, around the familiar kitchen table, they recounted the hearing in detail. Will listened intently, occasionally interjecting with colorful commentary about Blackwood's lawyers and their tactics. When they finished, he raised his coffee cup in a toast. To justice, he said. May it finally catch up with those who've been outrunning it. To justice, Caleb and Eliza echoed. Later, after Will had retired to his cabin, Caleb walked Eliza to her bedroom door. They stood in the hallway, suddenly awkward in a way they hadn't been before. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. Sleep well, Caleb said softly. You too. Eliza hesitated, then stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. Good night, Caleb. His hand came up to touch where her lips had been, his expression one of wonder. Good night, Eliza. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. For the first time since her mother died, she felt like she had a future worth looking forward to. Not just survival, but life. Real life, with possibilities and hopes and maybe even happiness. Outside her window, the moon rose over the mountains, painting the world in silver light. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, familiar and comforting. And Eliza, who had once been sold like property, who had been hunted and threatened and nearly destroyed, finally allowed herself to believe that she might actually be safe, that she might actually be free, that she might actually deserve love. The trial wouldn't happen for months yet, and there would be more battles to fight, more dangers to face. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was simply a woman who'd been given a choice and had chosen hope. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was victory enough for now. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to the ranch that felt almost normal. Spring work consumed their days, repairing winter damage, preparing fields, tending to newborn calves. Eliza threw herself into the routine, finding comfort in the predictability of honest labor. But now, everything was colored by the knowledge of what lay between her and Caleb, this new understanding that changed the weight of every glance, every accidental touch, every shared smile across the dinner table. Caleb was true to his word about courting her properly. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow, their stems carefully wrapped in cloth. He asked permission before taking her hand during their evening walks. He spoke to her of his dreams for the ranch, his past, his hopes for the future, as if building a foundation of honesty brick by careful brick. And he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her words mattered more than anything else in the world. Tell me about your mother, he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and rose. Eliza hadn't talked about her mother in years. The memories were too painful, wrapped up as they were with everything that came after. But with Caleb, she found the words coming easier. She was gentle, Eliza said quietly. Too gentle for the world, maybe. She loved poetry and music. She used to sing while she worked, these old songs from when she was a girl in Pennsylvania. After my father died, she tried so hard to keep us afloat. We moved to St. Louis, and she took in sewing, but it was never quite enough. She paused. Then Frank came along with his smooth words and promises, and she wanted so badly to believe in fresh starts. I think she knew deep down what kind of man he was, but she was tired of struggling alone. She was trying to protect you, Caleb said. She was, just not in the right way. Eliza looked at him. I used to be angry with her for that, for choosing Frank, for bringing us west, for dying and leaving me with him. But I'm not anymore. She did her best with what she knew. That's all any of us can do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Caleb spoke again. My mother was strong, had to be, married to my father. She worked harder than any man I've known, trying to hold our farm together while he drank. When she died, I think part of it was just exhaustion. She'd spent her whole life fighting, and she just didn't have any fight left. I'm sorry. Me too. But she taught me something important before she died. She told me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what you do after you've been broken, whether you let it destroy you or whether you use the pieces to build something new. He looked at Eliza. You've done that. You've taken what happened to you, and instead of letting it break you, you're building a new life. With your help. We're building it together. His hand found hers, and they sat watching the light fade from the sky, neither of them needing to say more. Will watched their courtship with obvious approval, though he teased Caleb mercilessly about being soft and moon-eyed. But Eliza caught him smiling when he thought no one was looking, pleased to see the ranch filling with something other than just work and silence. "It's good for him," Will told Eliza one afternoon while they were both working in the garden she'd started. "Caleb spent so many years alone, keeping everyone at arm's length. I was starting to think he'd forgotten how to let anyone in." "He let you in," Eliza pointed out. "That's different. I'm just an old ranch hand. You're someone he's chosen to build a life with. That takes a different kind of courage." Will pulled a weed and tossed it aside. "He's been through his own hell, things he doesn't talk about much. His stepmother wasn't just unkind, she was cruel. Beat him when she thought he wasn't working hard enough, locked him in the cellar for days when he talked back. By the time he ran away, he was half-starved and covered in bruises." Eliza's hand stilled in the dirt. "I didn't know it was that bad." "He doesn't like to talk about it. Says dwelling on the past doesn't change it. But I think that's why he understood what you were going through. He knows what it's like to be treated as less than human, to have your choices taken away." That night, Eliza looked at Caleb with new eyes, seeing not just the strong, capable man he'd become, but the scared, hurt boy he'd been. It made her love him more, if that was possible. As May turned to June, news arrived that the trial date had been set for the first week of July. Prosecutor Warren sent a letter outlining what to expect and requesting that both Eliza and Caleb return to Leadville a week early to prepare their testimony. The reality of what lay ahead settled over the ranch like a shadow. "Are you frightened?" Caleb asked one evening. "Terrified," Eliza admitted. "What if we lose? What if Blackwood walks free? Then we'll deal with it, together." He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "But Eliza, I believe we're going to win. The evidence is too strong, the testimony too consistent. Blackwood's money and influence can only stretch so far. And after? If we do win, then you're truly free. No more looking over your shoulder, no more fear. You can decide what kind of life you want without anyone else's claims hanging over you." He paused. "And I'm hoping you'll decide you want to stay here. With me." She pulled back to look at him. "Is that your way of proposing?" "No." His expression was serious. "When I propose, if I propose, you'll know it. I'll do it right, with the words that actually express what I feel instead of stumbling around like a fool." He smiled slightly. "But I wanted you to know my intentions, so there's no doubt." "There's no doubt," Eliza said softly. "Caleb, I love you. I know I'm supposed to wait and be sure and take my time, but I am sure. I love you." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. Caleb's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. Then he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her, properly this time, a kiss that held nothing back. It was everything Eliza had imagined and more, gentle but passionate, respectful but desperate, a promise and a plea all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too. God, Eliza, I've loved you since that night in Coleridge when you stood in that room looking terrified but refusing to break. I've just been too scared to say it." "Scared? You?" "Terrified. Scared you'd feel obligated to return the feeling. Scared I'd mess this up somehow. Scared I'd lose you." His thumb brushed her cheek. "But I'm done being scared. I love you, Eliza Rowan, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it." They held each other as the stars came out, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Finally, reluctantly, they parted for the night. But Eliza lay in her bed feeling more alive than she could remember, her whole body humming with joy and anticipation. The journey to Leadville the second time felt different. They traveled the same roads, stayed at the same inn, but everything was colored by hope rather than fear. Eliza and Caleb were no longer just employer and employee or even friends. They were something more, something that didn't need a label to feel real and solid and permanent. The trial began on a Monday morning, hot and humid, with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. The courthouse was even more crowded than during the preliminary hearing, packed with reporters from newspapers as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. The case had attracted attention throughout the territory. A powerful man brought down by his own arrogance, a young woman brave enough to stand up to him, a rancher willing to risk everything for what was right. Judge Holbrook presided again, her stern presence keeping order in the packed courtroom. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. Warren called witness after witness, building a picture of Blackwood's actions that was impossible to dismiss. The men who'd attacked the ranch testified again, their stories unchanged. Sarah Kent from the boarding house described the night of the auction in painful detail. A doctor testified about the injuries sustained by Blackwood's hired men when Caleb shot them. But it was when Eliza took the stand that the courtroom fell completely silent. She was calmer this time, her fear tempered by anger and determination. She told her story clearly, meeting Blackwood's eyes when she described what he'd tried to do to her. She didn't cry, didn't falter, didn't give Thornton any ammunition for his cross-examination. And when Thornton tried his tricks again, tried to make her seem like a gold digger or a liar or a troublemaker, Eliza stood her ground. "Mr. Thornton, I understand you have a job to do," she said when he'd been particularly aggressive. "But let me be absolutely clear. I didn't ask to be sold. I didn't want to be kidnapped. I didn't invite men to my home to threaten me and try to burn me alive. Your client did all of that because he couldn't accept that someone had disrupted his plans. He treated me like property he had a right to, and when I escaped, he tried to destroy me. No amount of fancy words from you can change those facts." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of approval. Judge Holbrook banged her gavel but couldn't quite hide her own approving expression. Even Thornton seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Caleb's testimony was equally powerful. He described Blackwood's men breaking into his home, assaulting Eliza, threatening murder. He produced the contract he'd drawn up with Eliza, proving she was a legitimate employee with legal rights and protections. He detailed every attempt Blackwood had made to reclaim what he considered his property. "Mr. Mercer," Thornton said during cross-examination, "you've admitted to spending $1,500 on Miss Rowan. Some might say that's not the action of a simple Good Samaritan. Some might say you had ulterior motives." "Then those people would be wrong," Caleb replied. "My motive was simple. I saw someone in trouble and I had the means to help. That's not ulterior. That's human decency." "And now you're courting her, aren't you? This woman you rescued?" "I'm courting her because I love her, because she's brave and strong and worthy of love. But that has nothing to do with why I helped her. I helped her because it was right. The fact that we fell in love afterward doesn't change that." "How convenient." "Not convenient. Fortunate. But, sir, I'd have helped any woman in that situation, whether I eventually fell in love with her or not. The fact that you can't seem to understand the difference between genuine compassion and self-interest says more about you than it does about me." The courtroom burst into applause. Judge Holbrook banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but even she couldn't suppress a small smile. The defense's case was predictably weak. Blackwood took the stand and claimed everything had been a misunderstanding. The auction was just a social gathering that got out of hand. The attempted kidnapping was his men acting without authorization. The barn attack was carried out by criminals he'd supposedly fired weeks earlier. His testimony was smooth and practiced, but it rang hollow against the weight of evidence against him. The trial lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors. Spectators argued and exclaimed. Blackwood sat frozen at his table, his face ashen, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening to him. Thornton was already preparing appeals, but everyone knew it was over. Silas Blackwood was going to prison. Judge Holbrook sentenced him to 15 years for conspiracy to kidnap and attempted murder. His business assets would be liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, including Eliza. His empire, built on intimidation and control, crumbled in a matter of minutes. Eliza watched it all feeling strangely detached, as if this were happening to someone else. Then Caleb's arm came around her shoulders, grounding her, reminding her this was real. They'd won. It was over. Outside the courthouse, they were mobbed by reporters asking questions, well-wishers offering congratulations. Marshal Cartwright shook both their hands vigorously. "You two did the territory a service," he said. "Blackwood's been terrorizing people for years. Now maybe others will find the courage to come forward about their own experiences with him." Mrs. Patterson appeared through the crowd and embraced Eliza warmly. I'm so proud of you, dear. You stood up to evil and won. That takes extraordinary courage. They stayed in Leadville only long enough to complete the necessary paperwork and meet with Warren about the restitution process. Blackwood's seized assets would be distributed among his victims, and Eliza stood to receive several $1,000s, far more than she'd ever dreamed of having. What will you do with it? Caleb asked as they rode back toward the ranch. Eliza had been thinking about that. Some of it I want to save, but some I'd like to invest in the ranch, if you'll let me. Buy more cattle, maybe improve the irrigation system. Be a real partner, not just an employee. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, Eliza, I've been thinking about something. About us, and the ranch, and the future. Her heart began to race. Yes? He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, then helped her down from hers. They were in a meadow carpeted with wildflowers, mountains rising in every direction, the sky impossibly blue overhead. It was beautiful, peaceful, perfect. Caleb took both her hands in his. I told you I'd do this right, and I meant it. So here it is. He took a deep breath. Eliza Rowan, you are the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You've been through hell and come out the other side not just surviving, but thriving. You make me want to be better than I am. You make me believe in futures worth building and dreams worth chasing. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Tears were already streaming down Eliza's face. I'm not a wealthy man, and ranch life is hard. But what I can offer you is a life built on respect, honesty, and partnership. A life where you'll always have a voice, always have a choice, always be valued as an equal. He squeezed her hands gently. Eliza, will you marry me? Not because you're grateful or obligated, but because you want to. Because you choose me the way I choose you. For a moment, Eliza couldn't speak through her tears. Then she threw her arms around his neck. Yes, yes, Caleb, I'll marry you. I choose you. I'll always choose you. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around, both of them laughing and crying at once. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Eliza felt like her heart might burst from sheer happiness. I don't have a ring yet, Caleb admitted when they finally broke apart. I wanted to ask you first, make sure you'd say yes before I went spending money. I don't need a ring. I just need you. Eliza touched his face wonderingly. How did I get so lucky? I'm the lucky one. He kissed her again, softer this time. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for being brave enough to believe in second chances. They rode the rest of the way home with Eliza seated in front of Caleb on his horse, her back against his chest, his arms around her. She'd never felt so safe, so cherished, so completely and utterly free. Will met them at the ranch with a knowing grin. Well, how'd it go? Blackwood got 15 years, Caleb said, and Eliza said yes. Yes to what? Will's grin widened. To marrying me, you old fool. Will let out a whoop and grabbed them both in a bear hug. About damn time! I was starting to think I'd have to knock your heads together. He pulled back, his eyes suspiciously shiny. Congratulations, both of you. You deserve every happiness. They celebrated that night with a special dinner and the bottle of whiskey Will had been saving for a momentous occasion. They toasted to justice, to freedom, to new beginnings. And later, after Will had retired and they sat alone by the fire, Caleb and Eliza talked about their future. I want to do this soon, Caleb said. The wedding, I mean. I don't see the point in waiting. Neither do I. Eliza leaned against him. Mrs. Patterson offered to help plan it. She says the church in Pine Ridge would be perfect. That sounds nice. Simple, but nice. He paused. Eliza, there's something else I want to talk about. The ranch. I want your name on the deed. Equal ownership. She sat up to look at him. Caleb, you don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. I want to. This is going to be your home too. Your legacy too. I want it to be truly ours, not just mine with you living here. His expression was serious. I never want you to feel like you're dependent on me or at my mercy. I want you to have security independent of our marriage. You really mean that? Every word. We're partners, Eliza, in every sense of the word. She kissed him, overwhelmed by gratitude and love. "Have I told you lately that you're an extraordinary man?" "Not in the last hour," he smiled, "but I'll never get tired of hearing it." They set the wedding for early August, giving them time to prepare, but not so much time that they drive themselves crazy with waiting. Mrs. Patterson threw herself into helping with arrangements, clearly delighted to have a wedding to plan. Sarah Kent came out from Coleridge to help Eliza sew a proper dress, claiming she owed Eliza a debt for her bravery at the trial. "You made the rest of us look at ourselves in our silence," Sarah said, as they worked on the cream-colored silk. "Some of us didn't like what we saw. I've decided I'm moving to Denver, starting fresh where nobody knows me as that woman who did nothing. Maybe I can be someone different there." "Good for you," Eliza said sincerely. "Everyone deserves the chance to start over." The news of the wedding spread quickly. Neighboring ranchers sent congratulations and offers to help with the celebration. Even people who'd been skeptical about Caleb and Eliza's arrangement seemed genuinely happy for them now. The trial had vindicated them, proven that their relationship was built on genuine feeling rather than obligation or convenience. A week before the wedding, Eliza received an unexpected letter. It was from Frank, postmarked from somewhere in Wyoming. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was brief and clumsy, clearly written by someone unused to expressing emotion. Frank wrote that he'd heard about the trial, about her upcoming marriage. He wrote that he was sorry, though the words felt inadequate. He said he'd been a coward and a fool, and he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted her to know he was grateful she'd found happiness despite what he'd done to her. Eliza read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. She felt nothing, not anger, not pain, not even satisfaction. Frank was part of her past, but he had no power over her future. She tucked the letter away in a drawer and never thought about it again. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Eliza dressed in her new gown with Mrs. Patterson's help, her hands steady, her heart full. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the frightened girl who'd been nearly sold in a dirty saloon room. This was someone new, someone strong, someone free, someone loved. The church was packed with friends and neighbors. More people than Eliza had realized cared about them. Will stood up with Caleb as his best man, looking proud enough to burst. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row dabbing at her eyes. When Eliza walked down the aisle, Caleb's expression made her breath catch. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world, like she was something precious and miraculous. And when they stood together before the minister and spoke their vows, Eliza's voice was clear and sure. "I, Eliza Rowan, take you, Caleb Mercer, to be my husband. I promise to be your partner in all things, to stand beside you in joy and sorrow, to choose you every day for the rest of my life. You gave me back my freedom, and I freely give you my heart." Caleb's own voice was thick with emotion. "I, Caleb Mercer, take you, Eliza Rowan, to be my wife. I promise to honor your strength, respect your choices, and love you without condition. You've made me believe in goodness again, and I'll spend my life being worthy of your trust." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by cheers and applause. But Eliza barely heard it. She was too busy memorizing this moment. The feel of Caleb's lips on hers, the warmth of his hands, the knowledge that she was choosing this, choosing him, choosing a future built on love rather than fear. The celebration afterward was joyous and chaotic. There was music and dancing, food and laughter. Neighbors who'd traveled from miles around brought gifts, practical things like blankets and tools, but also books and pretty dishes and other tokens of welcome. Eliza was embraced by women who'd once been strangers, congratulated by men who'd once viewed her with suspicion. As the sun set and the party showed no signs of slowing, Caleb pulled Eliza aside. "Want to escape? Isn't that rude? It's our wedding." "They'll understand. Besides, I've been waiting all day to have you to myself." His smile was warm and intimate. "Come on, Mrs. Mercer. Let's go home." Mrs. Mercer. The name sent a thrill through her. They slipped away while the party continued, riding home through the gathering dusk. The ranch looked beautiful in the fading light, solid and welcoming. Their home, their future. That night, as they lay together in the bed they would share for the rest of their lives, Eliza thought about the journey that had brought her here. from terror to safety, from desperation to hope, from property to partnership. It seemed impossible that so much could change in less than a year. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked softly, his fingers trailing through her hair. "That I'm grateful, that I'm happy, that I can't believe this is real. It's real." He pulled her closer. "And it's forever, if I have anything to say about it." "Forever," Eliza echoed. "I like the sound of that." The years that followed proved them both right. The ranch thrived under their joint management, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the territory. Eliza's business sense complemented Caleb's ranching skills perfectly. They added more cattle, improved their breeding stock, and eventually began training horses as well. Their first child, a daughter, was born the following spring. They named her Margaret, after Judge Holbrook, and she had her mother's determination and her father's steady temperament. A son followed 2 years later, then another daughter, then twin boys who kept everyone perpetually exhausted. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family, but it remained a warm, welcoming place. Eliza insisted on a large kitchen table where everyone could gather for meals, and on Sunday afternoons the house was often full of neighbors and friends. Will became Uncle Will to the children, teaching them to ride and rope and all the skills they'd need to run a ranch someday. Eliza never forgot where she'd come from. As the ranch prospered, she began helping other women in difficult circumstances, offering employment to those fleeing bad situations, providing references and support to those seeking fresh starts. She became known throughout the territory as someone who would help, no questions asked. When their eldest daughter asked why her mother cared so much about helping others, Eliza told her the truth. "Because someone helped me when I needed it most. Your father gave me a choice when everyone else saw me as property. That changed everything, and now it's my turn to pass that gift along." "What happened to the bad man? The one who tried to hurt you?" "He went to prison, and he stayed there until he was very old. Some people heard he died there, never having learned his lesson." "Good," Margaret said with childish certainty. "Bad people should face consequences." "Yes, they should, but the important thing isn't what happened to him, it's what happened to me. I could have let what he did destroy me. Instead, I chose to build something good. That's always the real victory, not revenge, but healing, not bitterness, but growth." On their 20th anniversary, Caleb and Eliza rode out to the meadow where he'd proposed. The children were old enough to be left with Will for an afternoon, and they wanted time alone together, time to remember. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Marrying a rancher, choosing this hard life?" Eliza looked at him, at the gray beginning to thread through his hair, at the lines on his face earned through years of honest work and laughter. "Not for a single moment. This life, it's everything I never knew I wanted. You're everything I never knew I needed." "I asked you once to choose," Caleb said, "and you keep choosing me every day. That's the greatest gift you could give. You gave me the freedom to choose. That's the greatest gift you could give." She took his hand. "We saved each other, Caleb. That's the truth of it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift across the endless sky, feeling the warmth of the sun and the love they'd built together over 2 decades. Around them, the ranch buzzed with life, their children's laughter carrying from the house, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind moving through the grass like something alive. This was freedom, Eliza thought. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. The ability to wake each morning and decide how to live, who to love, what to build. For years she'd been defined by what had been done to her. Now she was defined by what she had chosen to become. A rancher, a wife, a mother, a woman who'd survived hell and chosen to create heaven in its place. Years later, when Eliza was old and surrounded by children and grandchildren, someone asked her what the most important moment of her life had been. They expected her to say her wedding day or the birth of her first child, or the day Blackwood was convicted. Instead, she thought back to that night in Coleridge, standing in a room full of men who saw her as property. She thought about Caleb standing up and offering her something radical and precious, a choice. "The most important moment," she said slowly, "was when I realized I could choose. That despite everything that had happened to me, despite all the ways people tried to break me, I still had the power to decide who I would become. That moment, understanding that freedom is something you claim, not something that's given, that changed everything. She looked around at her family, at the legacy she and Caleb had built together. 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and a ranch that had become a refuge for anyone who needed it. A life built not on what was taken from her, but on what she chose to create. I was sold like property, Eliza continued, her voice still strong despite her years. But I refused to remain property. I chose dignity. I chose love. I chose to believe that my life could be more than my worst moment. And that choice, that one choice to believe in possibility, led to everything else. Her youngest granddaughter, barely 6 years old, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Grandma, were you scared?" "Terrified. Every day, for a very long time." "But you did it anyway." "Yes. Because being scared and being strong aren't opposites. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep choosing hope, even when you're afraid. That's what your grandfather taught me. That's what I'm teaching you." When Eliza passed away at the age of 73, surrounded by the family she'd built and the man who'd loved her for 52 years, her last words were simple. "Thank you for choosing me." And Caleb, holding her hand as he'd held it through every trial and triumph of their shared life, whispered back, "Thank you for choosing yourself. That's what changed everything." The ranch continued for generations after, run by their children and their children's children. And though the story of how it all began was told and retold, embellished and remembered, the core truth remained the same. A girl was put up for sale like property. A man gave her the power to choose. And she chose freedom, love, and a life worth living. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Not revenge against those who'd wronged her, but the creation of something good from the ashes of something terrible. Not the ending of one story, but the beginning of another. And what a beginning it was.